The camera was a Bell& Howell Autoload 308, purchased secondhand in a shop on Nathan Road for the equivalent of 47 American dollars. It shot Super 8 film at 18 frames per second, which meant the footage it produced had a slightly accelerated quality when projected, making everything look fractionally faster than real life. This was important, because what the camera was about to record didn't need to look faster. What the camera was about to record was already faster than anything it had ever been pointed at. The shop on Nathan Road had sold the camera to a young woman who spoke Cantonese with a mainland accent and who'd paid in cash without haggling, which marked her as either wealthy or in a hurry. She was neither. She was Linda Lee, wife of Bruce Lee, and she'd bought the camera as a birthday gift for her husband because he'd mentioned wanting to film his training sessions, and because a Bell & Howell was what the man at the shop recommended for someone who wanted reliable indoor footage without professional lighting. Bruce had been delighted with the camera the way he was delighted with all tools that served a functional purpose. Not sentimental about the object itself, but excited by its application. Within a week, he'd shot 4 reels of training footage, the heavy bag work and wooden dummy sequences and shadow boxing drills, each reel carefully labeled and stored in a cardboard box in his study at home. The labels were written in Bruce's precise handwriting, a blend of English and Chinese characters that reflected the man himself. A hybrid, a fusion, a person who existed at the intersection of 2 cultures and had made that intersection his permanent address. By March of 1972, the box contained 36 reels. Training footage, demonstration clips, experimental sequences where Bruce tested new techniques against the air and then against the wooden dummy and then against whoever was brave enough to stand in front of him and receive them. The reels were his laboratory notebooks, the visual records of an ongoing experiment in human movement that had consumed his intellectual life since he was 13 years old. The 37th reel would be different from all the others. The gym was on the 2nd floor of a building in Kowloon, above a tea shop whose owner, Mr. Young, had rented the space to Bruce for a price that was either very fair or very inflated, depending on which of them you asked. The stairs were narrow, wooden, creaking under any weight heavier than a child. The door at the top was steel, painted green, with a lock that required a specific combination of jiggling and shoulder pressure to open, a security feature that was more architectural accident than design. Inside, the space was small by gym standards, maybe 30 feet by 20. Wooden floors, sanded and sealed, dark with age and sweat and the accumulated residue of thousands of hours of training. A heavy bag hung from a ceiling beam, the leather scarred and dented, the chain above it reinforced twice because Bruce's kicks had a habit of testing the structural limits of whatever they contacted. A wooden dummy, the Mook Jong, stood against one wall, its 3 arms and single leg projecting from its cylindrical body like the appendages of an abstract sculpture. Mirrors covered the opposite wall, installed by Bruce because he believed in the pedagogical value of watching yourself move, of seeing what your body actually did rather than what your mind believed it was doing. 2 windows faced the street, filtering the sounds of Kowloon through glass that was never quite clean. The perpetual hum of Hong Kong, the traffic and voices and construction and music, entered the gym as a muffled backdrop, a reminder that the world existed outside these walls even though everything that happened inside them seemed to exist in a separate dimension of focus and intensity. The camera sat on a tripod in the far corner, positioned to capture the center of the room, where the wooden floor was clearest and the light from the windows was most even. Bruce had set it up himself that morning, adjusting the angle 3 times until he was satisfied that the frame would contain the full training area without cutting off the edges where footwork might carry the fighters. Fighters, plural, because today wasn't a solo training session. Wong Shunliang arrived at 2 in the afternoon, climbing the narrow stairs with the careful tread of a man who'd been climbing these kinds of stairs his entire life. Wong was 50 years old, 5'7", 155 pounds, and one of the most experienced real fighters in Hong Kong. Not a tournament fighter, not a forms competitor, a street fighter, a Bema fighter, a man who had answered and issued challenges in the Hong Kong martial arts underground for 30 years, and who had the scarred knuckles and the calm eyes and the absolute economy of movement that came from 3 decades of actual combat. Wong had been one of Yip Man's senior students, a Wing Chun practitioner of the highest level, and one of Bruce's earliest training partners. Their relationship was complicated in the way that relationships between talented people often were. Wong had taught the young Bruce Lee elements of Wing Chun that Bruce later incorporated into his own evolving system. Bruce had then moved beyond Wing Chun, creating Jeet Kune Do, absorbing elements from boxing and fencing and wrestling and every other fighting discipline he encountered. Some of Yip Man's students viewed this as betrayal. Wong viewed it as evolution. He didn't agree with everything Bruce had done with the foundation Wong had helped lay, but he respected the intelligence behind it. And he was curious, in the way that only genuine fighters were curious, about what the evolved Bruce Lee looked like at full speed. "You set up the camera," Wong observed as he entered the gym, his eyes finding the tripod in the corner immediately, the way a fighter's eyes always found the details of any room he entered. "I want to see what it looks like from outside," Bruce said. He was already in the gym, stripped to the waist, wearing only black cotton pants and bare feet. At 31, his body was the most refined version of itself it would ever be. The musculature was extraordinary not for its size, but for its definition, every muscle visible beneath skin that seemed to have no subcutaneous fat, the anatomy textbook illustration come to life. But the body wasn't the weapon. The body was the delivery system. The weapon was the mind that operated it. The 20 years of training and analysis and experimentation that had turned a skinny kid from Hong Kong into something that the existing vocabulary of martial arts couldn't quite describe. "Full contact?" Wong asked. "Full contact. Full speed. Everything allowed except what permanently damages." Wong nodded. He removed his shoes, set them by the door, and walked to the center of the floor. He was wearing a dark cotton t-shirt and loose pants, the standard training attire of a Wing Chun practitioner who didn't believe in spending money on specialized equipment when cotton worked fine. The two men stood in the center of the room, facing each other, with perhaps 8 feet between them. The camera watched from its corner. The windows filtered Kowloon's noise. The heavy bag hung motionless. The wooden dummy stood at attention, its arms extended, as if it too were watching. They bowed, not the deep, formal bow of traditional martial arts ceremony. A quick nod, the acknowledgment of mutual respect between men who'd known each other long enough that formality was unnecessary. The nod said what words didn't need to say. "I respect you. I trust you. Let's see what happens." They settled into their stances. Bruce adopted the modified Jeet Kune Do position that he'd been refining for years, left side forward, left hand extended at chest height, right hand near his right pectoral, weight distributed with a slight bias toward the rear foot, knees bent, body angled approximately 45 degrees to his opponent. The stance was a compromise between the Wing Chun centerline orientation he'd been taught as a teenager and the Western fencing stance he'd studied in his 20s, blending the directness of the former with the mobility of the latter. Wong adopted the Wing Chun stance that was his native position, as natural to him as standing upright was to a non-fighter. Square to Bruce. Weight slightly forward, both hands at center chest height. Elbows down, the characteristic guard of a system that prioritized the center line and used forward pressure as its primary tactical approach. Wong's stance was simpler than Bruce's, more traditional. But simplicity in a man with 30 years of street fighting experience was not a limitation. It was a refinement. Wong had tried every variation and returned to the basics because the basics, in his hands, were sufficient. Bruce reached over to the camera and pressed the record button. The mechanism engaged with a soft mechanical whir, the film beginning to roll, 18 frames per second capturing whatever fell within the lens's field of view. Bruce walked back to his position 8 feet from Wong, and settled into his stance again. What the camera recorded over the next 9 minutes would travel 8,000 miles and survive 16 years, and change how the heavyweight champion of the world understood fighting. But in this moment, it was just 2 men in a room above a tea shop, about to test each other. The first round lasted approximately 3 minutes. Wong initiated, as Wing Chun practitioners always did, moving forward, closing distance, seeking the close range where Wing Chun's trapping and chain punching dominated. His advance was not a charge. It was a steady, pressured walk, the kind of forward movement that compressed the space between fighters and forced the retreating fighter to either engage at close range or give up ground indefinitely. Bruce gave ground, not passively, not as a retreat, but as a tactical withdrawal that maintained his preferred fighting distance while Wong pressed forward. His footwork was lateral as much as backward, angular movements that changed the angle of engagement with each step, preventing Wong from establishing the direct centerline pressure that Wing Chun required. On the film, the footwork would look almost casual. Bruce appeared to be dancing, his weight transfers smooth and seamless, his feet barely leaving the floor, the movements so efficient that they seemed effortless. But Wong, who was the one trying to close the distance, knew the footwork was anything but casual. Every step Bruce took created a new angle. Every angle required Wong to readjust his center line. Every readjustment cost Wong a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, Bruce was moving again. Bruce's first offensive action was a low kick. Right leg, targeting the outside of Wong's lead thigh. The shin impacting the quadricep with a short, chopping motion that traveled no more than 18 inches. The kick was not designed to damage. It was designed to disrupt. Wong's forward pressure depended on stable legs, and a kick to the lead leg compromised that stability, even if the compromise was brief. Wong absorbed the kick with a grunt. His leg buckled slightly, but held. Wing Chun had no low kicks in its traditional curriculum, which meant Wong had no trained defense against them. He'd encountered kicks in his behemoth fights, but not kicks of this speed delivered from this angle with this timing. The kick arrived while Wong was mid-step, his weight transferring to the lead leg, the leg at its most vulnerable. Bruce kicked again. Same target, same technique, different timing. This time Wong was ready, shifting his weight backward to reduce the impact, but the shift interrupted his forward pressure, which was the kick's real purpose. Bruce had purchased distance, purchased time, purchased the right to dictate the range at which the fight would be conducted. Wong adjusted, changed his approach angle, came forward on a diagonal rather than a straight line, tried to neutralize the low kicks by staying outside their optimal range. It was the adaptation of an experienced fighter, the real-time problem-solving that separated men who fought for real from men who trained for forms. They met in the middle. Wong's hands found Bruce's lead arm, and the exchange transitioned to close range. The range Wong wanted, the range where Wing Chun's trapping and chain punching operated. Wong's hands were fast, practiced, the muscle memory of 30 years driving them in the patterns that had won him dozens of real fights. Chain punches, the rapid-fire straight punches that traveled the centerline one after another, each one following the path of the last, the cumulative effect like a jackhammer rather than a single blow. Bruce covered. His forearms caught the chain punches, deflecting some, absorbing others. 2 or 3 landed on his ribs, the impact audible on the film as dull thuds, the sound of fists meeting a body that was conditioned to receive blows but still registered their arrival. Bruce's torso flexed with each impact, the muscles contracting to absorb force, the breathing pattern adjusting to accommodate the compression. Then Bruce countered. The straight lead came from his left hand, which had been at chest height in his guard position, and it crossed the distance between guard and Wong's chin in a time interval that the camera could not accurately record. At 18 frames per second, the camera captured Bruce's hand in its starting position, and then, in the next frame, Bruce's hand was at Wong's chin. The space between those 2 frames, the 12 to 15 inches of travel that the punch covered, was simply absent from the visual record. The punch existed in the gap between frames, in the invisible space that 18 images per second couldn't reach. Wong's head snapped back. His chain punches stopped. His forward pressure interrupted, his balance disrupted, his central nervous system processing the sharp impact of a fist arriving at his jaw faster than his eyes could track it. Wong stepped back, the first backward step he'd taken in the round, the first concession of ground. On the film, the straight lead would look like a magic trick, a glitch, an error in the footage. The hand was here, then the hand was there, and the man in the dark t-shirt was stumbling backward. No wind-up, no telegraph, no visible transition from rest to impact. Just before and after, with the during removed, as if someone had cut the middle out of the film. The first round continued for another minute. Both men recalibrated, adjusted, tested new angles and timings. Wong landed more body shots, proving that his close-range skills were genuine and that Bruce's ribs would carry bruises tomorrow. Bruce landed 2 more straight leads and another low kick, proving that his range control and speed advantage were equally genuine. When they paused for water after the first round, both men were breathing hard, not gasping but working. The exertion of 3 minutes of full contact fighting against a skilled opponent was significant even for men in peak condition. They drank water from bottles, said nothing to each other, their communication existing in the nods and the eye contact and the unspoken assessment that each was making of the other. The second round changed the dynamic. Bruce initiated this time, not the patient, counterfighting approach of the first round. An aggressive, forward strategy that put Wong on the defensive immediately. The combination that began the round was a sequence that Bruce had been developing for months. Low kick to the lead leg, straight lead to the face, left hook to the body. 3 techniques delivered in approximately 1 second, each one flowing from the one before it with a seamless connectivity that Bruce called broken rhythm, the unpredictable cadence that prevented an opponent from timing any individual strike. On the film, the combination would look like a single action rather than 3 distinct techniques. The low kick blended into the straight lead, blended into the hook with no pause between them, no reset, no moment where Bruce was between techniques rather than in one. This was the expression of a principle Bruce had been articulating for years. A fight is not a series of separate actions, but a continuous flow, and the fighter who could maintain that flow while his opponent was stuck in the gaps between his own actions would always have the advantage. Wong took the combination fully. The low kick dead-legged his left thigh. The straight lead snapped his head back. The hook landed on his lower ribs with a sound that the camera recorded as a deep, meaty thud, the sound of force meeting flesh at the structural limit of absorption. Wong staggered. Not dramatically, not the theatrical stumble of martial arts movies. A real stagger, the kind that happened when the balance systems in the inner ear received conflicting signals from a head that had just been struck and legs that had just been kicked. He recovered quickly, the muscle memory of 30 years of fighting restoring his balance before his conscious mind had finished processing what had happened. Bruce pressed. Another combination, this one shorter, straight lead, hook. Wong covered the straight lead, but the hook found the same ribs, and Wong's body flexed around the impact, his left arm dropping to protect the damaged area. With his left arm down, his left side was open, and Bruce's next technique was a sweep, his right leg hooking behind Wong's lead ankle and pulling forward while his right hand pushed Wong's chest backward. Wong went down. His base, already compromised by the leg kick and the stagger, couldn't resist the sweep's mechanical advantage. He fell to his left side, catching himself on his forearm, his body hitting the wooden floor with a controlled impact that demonstrated his experience. He knew how to fall. Men who'd fought for 30 years knew how to fall. Bruce stepped back. This was the moment that would later stop Mike Tyson mid-sentence. Not the speed, not the combination, not the sweep, the step back. Bruce had his opponent on the ground. Wong was vulnerable, his base removed, his guard disrupted, his body on the floor where kicks and stomps and ground strikes could have ended the fight. Bruce had the option. He had the opportunity. He had the skill. He stepped back, gave Wong space, gave Wong time, waited. On the film, the step back was visible for exactly what it was, a conscious choice. Bruce's body was still in fight mode, his weight forward, his hands ready, his posture loaded with the potential energy of a man who could explode into action at any moment. But he chose not to. He chose restraint. He chose to let Wong stand, to let the fight continue on equal terms, to demonstrate a quality that had nothing to do with speed or power or technique. Control. The control to destroy and the control to choose not to. Wong stood, nodded once at Bruce, the nod carrying acknowledgment and respect, and the particular understanding that passed between fighters who'd just exchanged something real. Then Wong settled back into his stance, and the round continued. The third round was the most intense. Both men understood, through the accumulation of 2 rounds of full contact exchange, what the other was capable of. Wong knew that Bruce's straight lead was faster than anything he could track visually. Bruce knew that Wong's close-range skills were dangerous enough to hurt him, that the chain punches and the trapping were not theoretical threats, but genuine weapons that had already landed and would land again. They went to war. The film captured it in its imperfect 18-frame-per-second way. Movement blurring, impact moments frozen in accidental clarity. The bodies of 2 men operating at the edge of human capability, their actions faster than the technology recording them, their skills creating a visual record that would look, to untrained eyes, like a film running slightly too fast. But to trained eyes, the film showed something else entirely. It showed two men who knew exactly what they were doing. Every movement purposeful. Every technique aimed at a specific target with a specific intention. Nothing wasted. Nothing ornamental. The brutal, beautiful efficiency of real fighting between real fighters, where every action had a consequence, and every consequence informed the next action. Bruce's combination in the middle of the third round was the most complex thing on the film. Low kick to Wong's lead leg. Straight lead to Wong's face. When Wong's hands came up to protect the face, Bruce's hands transitioned to trapping, controlling Wong's lead arm with a pack saw that pinned it to Wong's chest. With Wong's arm trapped, Bruce delivered an elbow strike to Wong's solar plexus, a short, vicious technique that traveled maybe 6 inches and landed with an impact that folded Wong's body forward. For techniques, approximately 1.5 seconds. On the film, the sequence would be nearly impossible to decipher at normal speed. The individual techniques blended together into what looked like a single continuous motion, a flow of violence that started at Wong's leg and ended at Wong's solar plexus without any identifiable pause or transition. Wong responded, even hurt, even folded, even dealing with the respiratory compromise of solar plexus strike. Wong's 30 years of experience produced a response. His right hand, free of the trap, drove forward in a Wing Chun straight punch that caught Bruce on the ribs, the same ribs that had absorbed shots in the first round, the same ribs that would be purple and tender tomorrow. Bruce absorbed the shot and created distance. The exchange was over in 3 seconds. Both men hurt, both men having given and received. The ledger of the fight balanced in the way that real fights between skilled opponents were always balanced, neither side achieving clean dominance, both sides paying prices for the techniques they landed. Wong took the side kick at the end of the third round. Bruce's right foot drove into Wong's midsection with a linear thrust that was Bruce's signature technique, the same kick he'd used at a gas station in California 3 years later. Wong folded. His hands went to his midsection, his body bending forward over the impact point. The air left his lungs with a sound the camera faithfully recorded, a sharp exhalation that was almost a bark, the involuntary vocalization of a diaphragm under duress. Bruce could have followed up. The opening was there, the same opening that always existed when an opponent was folded and breathless and unable to defend. The same opening Bruce would exploit at the gas station, though there he would follow with a dead leg kick, and there would be no stepping back, because at the gas station there would be a child in the car, and restraint toward wrestlers would not be the appropriate choice. Here, in the gym, against a friend and respected fighter, Bruce stepped back again. The same step, the same choice, the same control. Wong straightened. Slowly. The solar plexus kick had taken more from him than anything else in the session. He stood, breathing carefully, assessing his body status with the internal diagnostic that experienced fighters performed automatically after taking significant shots. He raised his hand. The universal signal. Enough. Bruce nodded, relaxed his stance, let his hands drop. They stood in the center of the gym, 8 feet apart, both men breathing hard now, both men carrying the evidence of 9 minutes of full contact fighting. Wong's face showed the effect of the straight leads, a redness on his jaw, a slight swelling at the point of impact. Bruce's torso showed the effect of Wong's work, pink marks on his ribs where the chain punches and body shots had landed. Neither man was bleeding. Neither man was seriously injured. But both men had been a real fight, the kind of fight that existed only between people who trusted each other enough to go there and skilled enough to come back. They embraced, not the careful, one-armed hug of casual acquaintances. A full embrace, both arms, chest pressed together, the kind of hug that happened between men who just shared something that couldn't be shared with anyone who hadn't experienced it. The hug of warriors. Brief, tight, loaded with respect. Wong stepped back, nodded once more, and began putting on his shoes. The session was over. The data had been collected. The experiment had been conducted. Bruce walked to the camera. He leaned toward it, reaching for the stop button. In doing so, his face filled the frame. Close up, intimate, the kind of shot that a cinematographer would have spent hours lighting and composing. But this wasn't composed. It was accidental. Bruce reaching for the button, and, in the reaching, presenting his face to the lens from a distance of perhaps 12 inches. His face was sheened with sweat, the perspiration catching the window light and giving his skin a luminous quality that the 8mm film rendered as a soft glow. His hair was damp, strands displaced from their usual position, falling across his forehead. His breathing was visible in the movement of his chest at the bottom of the frame, the rise and fall that was faster than resting but already decelerating, his conditioning allowing recovery to begin even before the exertion fully ended. But it was his eyes that the frame captured most powerfully. They were looking directly into the lens, which meant they were looking directly at whoever would later watch this footage. The gaze was calm, focused, carrying the particular quality of a man who had just done something physically and mentally demanding and had emerged from it in full possession of himself. There was no wildness in the eyes, no residual aggression, no lingering combat arousal. Just clarity. The clarity of a man who knew exactly what he was and what he could do and who felt neither the need to prove it nor the desire to hide it. He smiled, faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting by perhaps 2 mm. The micro-expression of a man who was satisfied with what had just occurred but who wasn't interested in celebrating it. The smile was private, meant for himself, inadvertently captured by a camera that didn't know the difference between public and private expressions. Then his hand found the button. The image shook as his finger pressed it, and the film stopped. The projector, when this footage was eventually played, would show that final frame as a frozen image before the screen went white. Bruce Lee's face, 12 inches from the lens, eyes forward, faint smile, sweat on his skin, looking at the viewer across whatever span of time and distance separated the moment of recording from the moment of viewing. In 1975, Ted Wong would see that face and feel the loss of his teacher like a physical blow. In 1984, Cus D'Amato would see that face and write on the back of an electricity bill, "Show to Mike when he's ready." In 1988, Mike Tyson would see that face and sit in silence for 2 minutes, the heavyweight champion of the world unable to speak because the man on the screen was looking at him with eyes that saw everything and feared nothing. But that was all in the future. In March of 1972, the face belonged to a living man who was 31 years old and at the absolute peak of his physical and intellectual powers. A man who had 16 months left to live, though he didn't know it, and no one who loved him could have guessed it. A man who would die at 32 and leave behind a body of work that would change how the world understood fighting and a body of film that would travel 8,000 miles over 16 years to reach a darkened room in upstate New York where a 21-year-old with fists like concrete would watch it and say 5 words that no one expected. Bruce removed the reel from the camera. Small, lightweight, the physical medium so modest relative to the content it contained. A few ounces of plastic and celluloid holding 9 minutes of footage that would outlast everyone who appeared in it and most of the people who would ever watch it. He wrote on the reels box with a felt-tip pen, his handwriting quick and precise. WS Sparring. Full contact. March 72. He placed the box in the cardboard container with the other 36 reels. Number 37. One among many. A training record. A laboratory notebook entry. Nothing, in Bruce's assessment, particularly special. He'd review it later, analyze the footwork, identify the moments where his timing was off, note the body shots Wong had landed, and devise methods to prevent them in future sessions. Standard post-training analysis. Part of the process. He closed the cardboard box, placed it on the shelf in the gym where he kept his equipment and his records, changed into street clothes, locked the green steel door with its jiggling shoulder pressure lock, descended the narrow stairs, past Mr. Young's tea shop, into the noise and heat and density of Kowloon. He went home to Linda, who would ask about the session and receive a brief, technical summary that omitted the bruises on his ribs and the satisfaction in his chest. To Brandon, who was 7 now and who wanted to show his father a drawing he'd made at school. To Shannon, who was 3 and who wanted nothing more complex than to be picked up and held. A man going home to his family after work. The reels sat on the shelf in the gym. One among 37. Unlabeled except for Bruce's handwriting. Unseen except by the camera that recorded it and the 2 men who performed on it. Unaware that it would outlive the man who made it by decades. Unaware that it would cross an ocean. Unaware that it would be watched by a dead trainer's ghost student in a house in upstate New York, in a room where the smell of old boxing gloves and floor wax mixed with the smell of a dead man's memory. Unaware that it would make Mike Tyson say, I would never fight that man. The real waited. Patient. Still. The way film waited. The way the dead waited. The way truth waited. In whatever form it took, for the eyes that were ready to see it. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973, 16 months after the sparring session was filmed. He was 32 years old. Cerebral edema, the doctors said. Swelling of the brain. A reaction to a painkiller, possibly. An undetected condition, possibly. The explanations multiplied and contradicted each other, and ultimately failed to satisfy anyone who loved him, or anyone who studied him, or anyone who simply couldn't accept that a man in that kind of physical condition, a man whose body was a precision instrument maintained with obsessive care, could die in his sleep at 32 from something as mundane as a headache pill. The world mourned in the particular way the world mourns when it loses someone it hadn't finished understanding. Enter the Dragon, his masterpiece, wouldn't be released for another 6 days. The timing was grotesque. The film that would make Bruce Lee the most famous martial artist in history arrived in theaters while his body was being prepared for burial. The audiences who packed cinemas in Hong Kong, and then New York, and then London, and then everywhere else were watching a dead man move, a ghost performing at the peak of his physical powers, the celluloid preserving what death had already taken. In the house in Kowloon, in the study where Bruce had worked and read and thought, a cardboard box containing 37 reels of Super 8 film sat on a shelf and waited for someone to decide what to do with it. Linda Lee made that decision, along with every other decision that the sudden death of a husband and father required. She was 28 years old, a white woman from Seattle who'd married a Chinese man against her family's wishes and moved to Hong Kong and built a life that had been, until July 20th, extraordinary in its creative energy and ordinary in its domestic rhythms. Now, the extraordinary part was over, preserved in films and photographs and the memories of people who'd known him. And the ordinary part, the bills and the logistics and the children who needed feeding and the future that needed planning, was entirely her responsibility. She handled it, not gracefully, because grace was not what the situation demanded. Competently, with the organized determination of a woman who understood that grief was a luxury she could afford only in the margins of days that were otherwise filled with the practical requirements of survival. The box of films was not a priority. There were contracts to manage, estate matters to settle, a legacy to protect that was already being claimed by people who'd been distant acquaintances in Bruce's life and who now presented themselves as intimate friends. The box sat on its shelf through the summer and fall of 1973, undisturbed, its 37 reels patient in their containers, their content unknown to anyone except Bruce, who was dead, and Wong Shunliang, who had his own grief to manage and his own life to continue, and who did not ask about the films because asking felt intrusive and because Wong was a man who understood that some things needed to be left alone until the time was right. In early 1974, Linda began the process of organizing Bruce's archive. The films, the photographs, the notebooks filled with his handwriting, the books with his marginalia, the training equipment that still smelled like him. Each item required a decision. Keep, donate, store, share. The decisions were exhausting because each one required engaging with the physical evidence of a life that had ended too soon, and each engagement produced a fresh wave of the grief that Linda kept carefully contained during daylight hours and allowed to surface only at night, in the bed she'd shared with Bruce, in the dark that was now permanently, irreversibly hers alone. The film she divided into categories. The movie footage, the outtakes and behind-the-scenes material, went to the production companies and the archivists who were already building the institutional memory of Bruce Lee's film career. The personal footage, the family moments, Brandon's birthdays, Shannon's first steps, went into a separate box that Linda kept in her closet, where she could access it when she needed to see his face moving, alive, smiling at the camera with the particular warmth he reserved for his children. The training footage was more complicated. It was technical, specialized, relevant primarily to people who understood what they were looking at. Linda didn't train in martial arts. She understood the principles because Bruce had explained them to her, patiently and often, but she couldn't watch a reel of heavy bag work and distinguish between a straight lead and a hook kick with any confidence. The training reels needed to go to someone who could evaluate them, preserve what was important, and ensure that Bruce's technical legacy was maintained with the same rigor he'd applied to creating it. She called Ted Wong. Ted Wong was, by the time of Bruce's death, one of the people closest to Bruce's actual fighting methodology. Not the oldest student, not the most famous, but the one Bruce had spent the most private training time within the years leading up to his death. Ted was quiet, disciplined, technically precise, and absolutely devoted to the accurate preservation of what Bruce had taught him. If there was a single person on Earth who could look at Bruce's training films and understand every frame, it was Ted. Ted came to the house in Kowloon in the spring of 1974. He and Linda sat in Bruce's study, the room still carrying the faint scent of the cologne Bruce had worn, the books still on the shelves in the order Bruce had arranged them, the desk still holding the pen Bruce had last used. The room was a museum to a life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Linda showed him a box. 37 reels, all labeled in Bruce's handwriting. "I want you to have the training reels," Linda said. "The ones that are about the art. You'll know what to do with them. You'll know what's important." Ted took the box. He didn't open it in Linda's presence. Didn't sort through the reels or read the labels. That felt like something to be done in private, the way you read a letter from the dead in private, giving the dead the respect of your full attention rather than the distraction of social performance. He brought the box to his home in Los Angeles, set it on the table in his living room, opened it. 37 small boxes, each containing a reel of Super 8 film, each labeled in the handwriting of a man who was no longer alive to explain what was on them. Ted went through them systematically over the course of a week. He'd borrowed an 8mm projector from a friend, a chunky Bell and Howell unit that projected onto a white wall in Ted's small living room in Pasadena. Each evening after work, Ted would load a reel, turn off the lights, and watch. Most of the reels contained what their labels described: heavy bag work, wooden dummy sequences, shadow boxing, demonstrations of specific techniques for the camera, Bruce performing a straight lead or a hook kick or a trapping sequence in slow motion, and then at full speed, the pedagogical intent clear, the footage obviously created for review and analysis. Ted watched each reel with the attention of a student who would never have another lesson from his teacher, cataloging the content, making notes, filing each reel in the mental library he was building of Bruce's complete technical output. Reel 37 was different. Ted loaded it on a Thursday evening. Read the label. WS Sparring. Full Contact. March 72. WS. Wong Shunliang. Full Contact. March 1972. Ted's pulse increased before the first frame appeared on the wall. He knew what this was. Or rather, he knew what it might be. Bruce had mentioned, once, in passing, that he and Wong had filmed a sparring session. He'd mentioned it the way he mentioned all his training activities, casually, as part of the ongoing conversation about technique and development that constituted most of his interactions with Ted. He hadn't emphasized it, hadn't described it in detail, hadn't suggested that it was different from any other training record. The projector's lamp illuminated the wall. The countdown frames appeared, the numbers ticking backward in the mechanical rhythm of 8mm film. Then the image. Two men standing in the center of a room. One shirtless, lean, the musculature visible even in the grainy footage. The other in a dark t-shirt, shorter, stockier, the compact build of a man who carried his strength close to his center. They bowed, quick nods, and settled into their stances. Ted watched the first round without breathing. He was aware, distantly, that he'd stopped inhaling, that his lungs were holding whatever air they'd contained when the sparring began, but the awareness was insufficient to override the attention that the footage demanded. He'd sparred with Bruce hundreds of times. Hundreds. He knew Bruce's speed, knew his timing, knew the feel of his techniques landing on pads and body alike. He thought he knew what Bruce looked like at full output. He did not know. The Bruce on this film was different from the Bruce Ted had trained with. Not in kind, in degree. The techniques were the same. The straight lead was the same straight lead Ted had received thousands of times on the focus mitts. The low kicks were the same low kicks Ted had watched Bruce practice on the heavy bag. The footwork was the same angular, distance-controlling movement that Bruce had drilled into Ted's own muscle memory. But the speed was different. The intensity was different. The level of output was different. The Bruce on this film was operating at a capacity that Ted had never witnessed in person, a capacity that Bruce had apparently reserved for occasions when his opponent was skilled enough and trusted enough to receive it. The straight lead that hit Wong's chin was the moment Ted had to pause the projector. Not because the technique was unfamiliar, because it was invisible, Ted knew the straight lead intimately, could describe its mechanics from memory, could perform it himself with a precision that Bruce had spent years developing. But on the film, the straight lead didn't exist as a visible movement. It existed as a before and an after. Bruce's hand in guard position. Bruce's hand at Wong's chin. The transit between those two positions was absent, consumed by the gap between frames. The movement too fast for 18 images per second to capture. Ted rewound. Watched again. Still couldn't see it. Rewound. Watched again. Frame by frame this time. Advancing the projector manually, clicking through individual images. Guard position. Guard position. Contact. The punch covered its entire distance in the space between two frames. At 18 frames per second, that meant the punch traveled from guard to chin in less than 1/18th of a second. Less than 0.055 seconds. Ted sat in his living room in Pasadena, the projector humming, the image frozen on the wall, and understood something that reorganized his comprehension of his teacher. Bruce had been holding back. With all of them. Every student. Every sparring partner. Every person who'd ever stood in front of Bruce Lee and exchanged techniques with him had been receiving a modulated version of what Bruce was capable of. Not a reduced version, because even modulated, Bruce's skills were extraordinary. But a version with a governor on it, a self-imposed limitation that kept his output within the range that his training partners could safely receive. On this film, the governor was off. I trained with him for years, Ted said to the empty room, to the frozen image on the wall, to the ghost of his teacher looking out from the grainy 8mm frame. And I never saw this. He was holding back with all of us. Every single time. Ted finished watching the reel in silence. The second round with its devastating combination and the sweep that put Wong on the floor. Bruce stepping back, choosing restraint, giving Wong the space to stand. The third round with its escalating intensity. The four-technique combination that ended with the elbow to Wong's solar plexus. The side kick that folded Wong, the second step back, the second choice of restraint. The embrace, the walk to the camera, the face close up, the eyes looking into the lens, the faint smile. Ted turned off the projector, sat in the dark for a long time. Then he took the reel out of the projector, put it back in its box, and placed it in a separate location from the other 36 reels. Not in the cardboard container with the rest of the training footage. In a drawer in his bedroom, beneath his clothes, the way you stored something you didn't want found by casual visitors. Not because it was shameful, because it was sacred. The only known footage of Bruce Lee in real, full-contact combat. The only visual record of what Bruce Lee actually looked like when there was no camera he was performing for, no student he was teaching, no audience he was entertaining. When it was just Bruce and a worthy opponent and the truth of what he could do. Ted told no one about the reel for 3 years. In 1978, he told Richard Bustillo. Richard Bustillo was one of Bruce's original students from the Los Angeles Chinatown School, a Filipino-American martial artist who'd gone on to found the IMB Academy, one of the first schools to teach Jeet Kune Do after Bruce's death. Richard was rigorous, analytical, committed to preserving the technical accuracy of Bruce's methodology. He was also Ted's friend, one of the few people Ted trusted enough to share something this significant. They watched the reel together in Ted's living room. Same projector, same white wall, same small, dark room with the curtains drawn and the outside world excluded. Richard's reaction was different from Ted's, not in kind, but in emphasis. Where Ted, the technician, had been struck primarily by the speed of the straight lead and the realization that Bruce had been operating below capacity with his students, Richard, the analyst, was struck by the totality of what the film represented. He's faster on this film than in any of his movies, Richard said, the projector still running, his eyes fixed on the wall where Bruce was executing the four-technique combination in the third round. The movies are slow motion compared to this. The movies were choreography, Ted said. This is real. I know the difference. I've been teaching the difference for 5 years. But seeing it, Richard paused, searching for words adequate to the experience. Seeing it is different from knowing it. We talk about what Bruce could do. We teach what Bruce taught us. But this film shows what he actually did when nobody was watching. When it was just him and a real fighter and the door was closed. They watched it again, and then a third time. By the third viewing, both men had moved past the initial shock and into the analytical mode that their training demanded. They discussed the footwork, the timing, the combination architecture, the integration of kicks with hand techniques, the moments of restraint that punctuated the violence like pauses in a sentence. He could have finished Wong twice, Richard observed. Both times Wong went down or was hurt badly enough to be finished. Both times Bruce chose to stop. That's not something you see in fights, Ted said. Real fights. When a man goes down, you finish him. That's instinct. That's survival. To override that instinct in a moment, at full speed, at full contact, requires a level of conscious control that I've never seen in anyone else. It's what he taught us, Richard said. Control. Choice. The ability to select your response rather than being driven by reflex. He taught it, and on this film, he demonstrates it. Under pressure, against a real opponent, in real time. Richard asked for a copy of the reel. Ted refused. This stays with me, Ted said. Bruce wouldn't want this public. This is private. This is him at his most real. It belongs in a drawer, not on a screen. Richard respected the decision, but disagreed with it. In the weeks and months that followed, he mentioned the reel's existence to other people in the Jeet Kune Do community. Not in detail, not with descriptions of specific techniques or timestamps of specific moments. Just the fact of its existence. There's a tape of Bruce Lee fighting for real. Full contact, no choreography, and it's unlike anything you've ever seen. The information spread through the martial arts world with the particular velocity of significant rumors in small communities. Jeet Kune Do practitioners told other martial artists. Martial artists told their students. Students told other students. Each transmission added a layer of interpretation and a layer of distortion, the way all oral transmission did, the details becoming simultaneously more vivid and less accurate with each retelling. By 1980, the existence of the tape was known throughout the American martial arts community as a kind of article of faith. Some people believed it existed. Others dismissed it as mythology, the martial arts equivalent of a Bigfoot sighting, a story that got bigger and less verifiable with every telling. The people who believed split into factions. Those who thought the tape showed Bruce at his best, and those who thought it showed Bruce at his most vulnerable. The full contact format revealing limitations that the controlled environment of demonstrations and films concealed. None of them had seen it. Only two people had. Ted Wong, who kept it in his drawer and watched it alone on the anniversary of Bruce's death each year. A private memorial conducted in a dark room with a projector and a ghost. And Richard Bastillo, who had seen it once and who carried the memory with the care of a man holding a fragile thing that could never be replaced. The rumor crossed from the martial arts world to the boxing world in 1982 through a connection that neither world would have predicted. Freddie Roach was 22 years old in 1982, a lightweight boxer from Dedham, Massachusetts, who'd compiled a record of 26 wins and 13 losses over a professional career that was distinguished by heart and limited by talent. Freddie could take a punch better than almost anyone in his weight class, and he could throw combinations with a fluidity that suggested genuine skill, but he lacked the power and the chin to compete at the highest level. He knew this. He'd known it since his 15th fight, when a journeyman named Hector Lopez had knocked him down 3 times in 4 rounds, and Freddie had gotten up each time and lost the decision and understood, with the clarity that only defeat provides, that his future in boxing was behind a fighter, not in front of one. By 1982, Freddie was transitioning from fighter to trainer, working at the Wild Card Gym on Vine Street in Hollywood, a gym that would later become the most famous boxing gym in the world. But that was in 1982, just another sweaty room with a ring and a heavy bag and the smell of leather and ambition. Freddie trained whoever walked through the door, professionals and amateurs, serious fighters and weekend warriors, building the client base and the teaching methodology that would eventually produce champions. One of his regular sparring partners was a man named Danny Reyes, a welterweight who fought professionally on the Southern California circuit and who also, in his non-boxing hours, trained in Jeet Kune Do at a school in Torrance. Danny was one of the increasingly common cross-training fighters who'd begun appearing in the 1980s. Men who saw no contradiction in pursuing boxing and martial arts simultaneously, who understood that different disciplines offered different tools and that a complete fighter drew from every available source. Freddie and Danny sparred 3 times a week, and their post-sparring conversations ranged across the full spectrum of fighting topics. It was during one of these conversations, sitting on the ring apron with their gloves off and their hand wraps damp, that Danny mentioned the tape. There's footage of Bruce Lee fighting for real, Danny said, unwrapping his left hand with the slow, careful movements of a man whose fingers were sore. Not movie stuff. Actual sparring. Full contact. No rules. My JKD instructor says it's the scariest thing he's ever seen on film. Freddie's response was the response of a boxer who'd spent his professional life in a world where martial arts were viewed as theatrical and impractical. Bruce Lee was an actor, Freddie said. Not dismissively exactly, but with the casual certainty of a man who believed that real fighting happened in a ring between men who boxed and that everything else was performance. Danny looked at him. Not on this tape, he's not. The conversation moved on to other subjects, but the information lodged in Freddie's mind, filed in the part of his brain that collected potentially useful knowledge without immediately acting on it. Freddie was a collector of fighting information, a trait that would serve him brilliantly in his later career as a trainer. He stored everything, every observation, every piece of footage, every casual conversation that contained a grain of useful data. Most of it would never be retrieved, but some of it at the right moment, in the right context, would surface and prove valuable. The right moment came in 1983, when Freddie traveled to New York for a fight that fell through and found himself with 2 days to kill in a city where he knew exactly one person in boxing worth visiting. Kevin Rooney was a trainer working with Cus D'Amato in Catskill, New York, and Freddie knew him through the small, interconnected world of professional boxing, where trainers and fighters circulated between gyms and cities and formed relationships that persisted despite distance and competition. Freddie drove to Catskill. The town was small, quiet, upstate New York at its most rural, the kind of place where a boxing gym seemed as incongruous as a submarine in a cornfield. But Cus D'Amato had chosen it deliberately, the isolation serving both as a training environment free from the distractions of New York City and as a controlled space where the young fighters in his care could be shaped without the interference of the boxing world's considerable collection of predators and parasites. Kevin Rooney met Freddie at the gym. They talked boxing for 2 hours, the easy, detailed conversation of men who shared a language and a passion. At some point, the conversation drifted to training methods, to unconventional approaches, to the question of whether boxing could learn from other fighting disciplines. I heard something interesting, Freddie said. There's apparently footage of Bruce Lee. Real sparring, not movie stuff. Full contact. People in the martial arts world say it shows something pretty remarkable. Kevin Rooney's interest was professional but moderate. He was a boxing man, trained by Cus, focused on the sweet science to the exclusion of most other fighting forms. But Kevin had absorbed one critical lesson from Cus that most boxing trainers never learned. The lesson that useful knowledge existed outside boxing's boundaries and that a trainer who ignored that knowledge was choosing ignorance over competence. Cus would want to hear about that, Kevin said. You think. Cus studies everything. Fencing manuals, restraint technique, samurai philosophy. The man reads books about fighting the way other people read the newspaper. If there's footage of Bruce Lee fighting for real, Cus would want to see it. The idea was planted. It would take another year to germinate. In 1984, Kevin Rooney made the calls. The chain of connections ran backward from Kevin to Freddie to Danny Reyes, to Danny's JKD instructor, to Richard Bastillo. Richard, who'd been advocating for the tape's broader viewing since he'd first seen it, contacted Ted Wong. Ted said no. It stays with me. I've told you this. Bruce wouldn't want it public. Richard, this isn't public. This is Cus D'Amato. The name created a pause in Ted's refusal. Cus D'Amato. Even in the martial arts world, the name carried weight. Cus was not a typical boxing trainer. He was a student of fighting in the broadest sense. A man who'd read Sun Tzu and Musashi and who approached boxing not as a trade, but as a discipline, a comprehensive system for understanding human conflict that happened to express itself through punching. Cus respected martial arts. Cus studied martial arts. Cus was the rare boxing man who would watch a tape of Bruce Lee and see a fighter rather than a movie star. If anyone in boxing would understand what they're looking at, Ted said slowly, the words emerging against the resistance of his protective instinct, it's Cus. So you'll send it? I'll lend it. It comes back. This isn't a gift. It's a loan. Understood. The reel traveled from Ted Wong's drawer in Pasadena to Kevin Rooney's bag in Los Angeles, to Kevin Rooney's car on the I-80 to Kevin Rooney's hand in the hallway of a Victorian house in Catskill, New York. 8,000 miles from the gym in Kowloon, where it had been filmed. 12 years from the day Bruce had written WS Sparring. Full Contact. March 7-2 on its box. A small object on a long journey, carrying its content with the patient indifference of all physical media, unaware that it mattered, unaware that it was about to be seen by eyes that would understand it at a level that justified its journey. Kevin gave the reel to Cus on a Tuesday evening in October 1984. Cus was 76 years old, his eyesight compromised by cataracts that he refused to have surgically corrected because the surgery would require him to stop training fighters for 2 weeks, and Cus would rather see poorly than stop working. His body was failing in the slow, comprehensive way that bodies failed at 76. The joints stiffening, the stamina diminishing, the physical envelope shrinking while the mind inside it remained as sharp and hungry as it had been at 30. "What's this?" Cus asked, holding the small reel box in hands that were liver-spotted and arthritic, but still capable of wrapping a fighter's hands with the precision of a surgeon. "Bruce Lee," Kevin said. "Real Sparring. Full Contact. Filmed in Hong Kong in 1972. The martial arts people say it's the only footage of him fighting for real." Cus looked at the box. "Turn it over. Read the label in Bruce's handwriting. WS Sparring. Full Contact. March 72. "I want to watch this alone," Cus said. Kevin had expected this. Cus processed information in private the way other people prayed in private, the act of observation too intimate and too important to be contaminated by another person's presence. "I'll be in the gym," Kevin said, and left. Cus set up the projector in his study, a room on the second floor of the Victorian house that contained more books per square foot than most public libraries. Books on boxing, obviously, but also books on fencing, on military strategy, on psychology, on philosophy, on the Alexander technique and the Feldenkrais method and the biomechanics of human movement. Cus read the way he trained. Omnivorous, relentless, always looking for the principle beneath the technique, the truth beneath the tradition. The projector was the same bell and howl unit that Kevin had borrowed from Cus' neighbor, a retired schoolteacher who used it to show family vacation films and who had no idea that it was about to display footage that would be discussed in boxing circles for decades. Cus threaded the film with the careful fingers of a man who'd handled fragile things his entire life. The fragile hands of young fighters, and the fragile egos of champions, and the fragile film that contained the image of a dead martial artist. He turned off the lights, started the projector, sat in his reading chair. The chair positioned 4 feet from the white wall that served as a screen, close enough that his compromised eyesight could resolve the grainy 8mm image into identifiable forms. The countdown frames, the numbers, the image. 2 men in a room, one shirtless, lean, one in a dark shirt, compact. The nod, the stances. Cus watched the first round without moving. His eyes, squinting behind glasses that weren't quite strong enough, tracked the movement on the wall with the analytical intensity that had been his defining characteristic for 5 decades. He'd watched more boxing film than any person alive, had studied every great fighter of the 20th century through the medium of celluloid, learning their rhythms, their patterns, their strengths and vulnerabilities, building the mental database that informed his training of Floyd Patterson and Jose Torres, and now the young man sleeping downstairs who would, within 2 years, become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. Because I'd never watched anything like this. The speed was the first thing, not the speed of the individual techniques, though that was extraordinary. The speed of the transitions. The way Bruce moved from one technique to the next without the reset, without the pause, without the gap between actions that existed in boxing even at the highest level. In boxing, there was always a moment between punches, a fraction of a second where the fighter was between actions, resetting his balance, loading the next shot, transitioning from one technique to another. In this footage, that moment didn't exist. Bruce's techniques flowed into each other with a continuity that Cus had never seen in any fighter, in any discipline, on any film. The straight lead that was invisible between frames made Cus lean forward in his chair. He'd seen fast punches. He trained fast punchers. Floyd Patterson's jab had been timed at a speed that boxing journalists called the fastest in heavyweight history. Cus had watched that jab thousands of times, in person and on film, and he could see it. He could track its path from guard to target and back. He could not see Bruce Lee's straight lead. Cus watched the second round. the combination that opened it, the sweep that took Wong to the floor, and then the moment that would occupy more of Cus' subsequent thinking than any other moment on the film. Bruce stepping back. Cus had trained fighters to finish. The cardinal rule of his system was exploitation. When the opponent was hurt, you finished him. You didn't admire your work. You didn't hesitate. You didn't give him time to recover. You finished. This was not cruelty. It was professionalism. A fight that could be ended should be ended, because every additional second of fighting was an additional second of risk. Bruce Lee, on this film, violated that rule. Twice. Both times his opponent was down or hurt enough to be finished. Both times Bruce chose to step back. And both times, the choice was clearly conscious, clearly deliberate. The decision of a man who was in complete control of his actions and who chose restraint not because he lacked the ability to continue, but because he possessed the ability to stop. Cus watched the third round. The four-technique combination, the escalating intensity, the side kick that folded Wong, the third step back, the embrace, the close-up, the eyes in the lens. The projector ran past the end of the footage and threw white light on the wall. Cus sat in the white light, motionless. Then he rewound the film and watched it again. Then he rewound it and watched it a third time, this time stopping at specific moments, advancing frame by frame through the sequences that had struck him most forcefully. The straight lead, the combination, the sweep, the step-backs, the close-up. When the third viewing was complete, Cus turned on the desk lamp and reached for something to write on. The nearest available surface was an electricity bill that had arrived that morning, and that Cus had left on his desk with the intention of paying it eventually. He turned it over and picked up a pencil. His handwriting was small and precise, the penmanship of a man from a generation that valued legibility and who still wrote letters by hand because he believed typed words lacked character. Speed, beyond heavyweight classification, possibly beyond any classification. Timing, anticipatory, not reactive. He moves before the opponent commits. Control, full contact, but never out of control. More dangerous than wild. The restraint at the end. Could have finished. Chose not to. Discipline of a master, not a brawler. Cus paused. The pencil hovered over the paper. The lamp cast a warm circle of light in the otherwise dark room. Downstairs, he could hear the faint sounds of the house settling, the creak of old wood and old pipes, and the distant rhythm of a young fighter sleeping. The deep, heavy breathing of a 19-year-old whose body was recovering from the day's training. Mike, downstairs, sleeping. The boy Cus had taken from the streets of Brownsville, from the juvenile detention centers, from the trajectory that led to prison or death. The boy Cus had recognized, in the first 30 seconds of watching him throw a punch, as the most naturally gifted fighter he'd encountered in 50 years of looking. The boy Cus was building into a champion, not just of boxing, but of self, the champion of the war against his own demons that Mike fought every day, and that was far harder than any fight in a ring. Mike needed to see this film. Not now. Not yet. He was 19, still forming, still learning, still absorbing the principles that Cus was installing in his technical and psychological architecture. Showing him this film now would be premature. Mike would see the speed and the techniques and would react with the competitive aggression that was his default response to any display of fighting ability. He wanted to prove he was better. He'd missed the lesson. The lesson wasn't the speed. The lesson wasn't the techniques. The lesson was the control, the restraint, the ability to destroy, and the choice not to. That was what Mike needed to see, but he needed to see it at a time when he was mature enough to understand it. When he'd won enough to know what winning felt like, and had lived enough to know that winning wasn't enough. Cus wrote one more line on the electricity bill. Show to Mike when he's ready. Not yet. He put the pencil down, removed the reel from the projector, placed it in its box, put the box in the top drawer of his desk, beside his reading glasses and a half-finished letter to an old friend that he would never complete. Put the electricity bill with its notes beside the box. Turned off the lamp. Went to bed. In 13 months, Cus D'Amato would be dead. Pneumonia, the official cause. Old age, the real cause. The body finally refusing to carry the mind any further. The vehicle giving out while the driver was still alert and oriented and furious at the betrayal. He would never show Mike the film. The note, show to Mike when he's ready. Not yet, would remain in the drawer, an instruction from beyond the grave, a final act of teaching from a man who understood that the most important lessons were the ones that arrived at exactly the right time. Not a moment too soon, not a moment too late. The reel waited in the drawer. The note waited beside it. And downstairs, the 19-year-old who would become the most feared fighter of his generation slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a young man who didn't yet know what he didn't know. The knowledge would come. It would arrive on a Wednesday night in March 1988, projected on a bedsheet in a dark room, carried by light and shadow and the ghost of a man who'd been dead for 15 years, but who moved on a small reel of Super 8 film, with a speed and a control that made the baddest man alive sit in silence and say 5 words he'd never said about anyone. But that was still 3 years away. For now, the reel waited. The note waited. And the house in Catskill held its secrets in the darkness, the way old houses did, patient and silent and full of things that would matter enormously when the time was right. On November 4th, 1985, Cus D'Amato died in the house in Catskill. He was 77 years old. The pneumonia had been building for weeks, the fluid accumulating in lungs that were already compromised by age and by the particular stubbornness of a man who refused to rest because resting meant not training fighters, and not training fighters meant not living. Cus had trained through the illness the way he trained through everything, with the absolute conviction that willpower could overcome biology. Willpower could not overcome biology. On November 4th, at approximately 6 in the evening, biology won. Mike Tyson was in the gym when they told him. He was 19 years old, 12 fights into his professional career. All 12 victories, all 12 knockouts. The trajectory of his career so steep and so violent that the boxing world had already begun using words like phenomenon and once in a generation and the next great heavyweight. He was hitting the heavy bag when Kevin Rooney walked through the gym door with a face that told Tyson everything before Kevin opened his mouth. Kevin didn't open his mouth immediately. He stood in the doorway of the gym, the cold November air from outside mixing with the warm, leather-scented air inside, and looked at the young man hitting the bag with the concentrated fury that Cus had spent 3 years learning to channel. Kevin had known Cus for 12 years, had been trained by Cus, had absorbed Cus' philosophy and methodology, and had committed his professional life to transmitting that philosophy to the next generation. But Kevin's loss, however genuine, was the loss of a mentor. Mike's loss was the loss of father. Cus had legally adopted Mike, had taken a 13-year-old from Brownsville, Brooklyn, a boy with a juvenile arrest record and a speech impediment and a rage that expressed itself in street fights and petty crime, and the particular, corrosive hopelessness of a child who'd been told by every institution in his life that he was worthless. Cus had looked at that boy and seen a fighter. Not in the limited sense of a man who could hit hard, though Mike could hit very hard indeed. In a complete sense. A fighter. A person whose internal architecture, whose psychological wiring, whose relationship to fear and aggression and discipline and self-mastery could be shaped into something extraordinary. Everyone sees the fists, Cus had told Kevin once, watching a 14-year-old Mike demolish a heavy bag with combinations that would have been impressive from a professional twice his age. The fists are nothing. Anyone can develop fists. What I see is the other thing, the thing underneath, the fear that he converts into aggression, the intelligence that he hides behind the anger, the need, Kevin, the need to be something. That's what I'm working with. Not the fists, the need. Cus worked with the need for 6 years. From 13 to 19, he shaped Mike Tyson the way a sculptor shaped clay, not by adding material, but by removing what didn't belong. The rage that had driven Mike's street fights was not eliminated. It was directed. The fear that Mike carried, the deep, foundational terror of a boy who'd been bullied and abandoned and institutionalized, was not removed. It was transformed. Cus taught Mike that fear was fuel, that the energy fear generated could power a fighter through situations that would paralyze someone who hadn't learned to use it. The hero and the coward both feel the same thing, Cus told Mike, in a conversation that Mike would repeat in interviews for the rest of his life. The difference is what they do with that feeling. The coward runs. The hero acts. But the master, Mike, the true master, doesn't feel the need to run or act. Because the master is in control, not of the situation, of himself. Mike had listened, had absorbed, had incorporated Cus' teachings into the psychological architecture that supported his physical gifts. By 19, He was the most complete young fighter the sport had seen in decades. The peekaboo style that Cus had designed specifically for his body type and his temperament functioning at a level that made experienced boxing observers use words they normally reserved for historical discussions of the sport's all-time greats. And then Cus died, and the architecture lost its architect. Kevin told Mike in the gym. The words were simple. He's gone, Mike. Cus is gone. Mike Tyson, who'd knocked out 12 professional heavyweights without showing a flicker of vulnerability, who'd walked to the ring against men who outweighed him by 30 and 40 pounds with the calm aggression of a predator who'd already decided the outcome, sat down on the gym floor and wept. Not the contained, dignified weeping of a man managing his grief for public consumption. The raw, uncontrolled sobbing of a 19-year-old boy whose father had just died. The sound filled the gym, bouncing off the heavy bags and the ring ropes and the concrete walls, the sound of loss in its most fundamental form. A child losing the person who made the world make sense. Kevin sat beside him on the gym floor. Didn't speak. Didn't touch him. Just sat, sharing the space, offering presence without intrusion. They sat for an hour. Mike cried for most of it, then went quiet, then cried again, the grief arriving in waves that couldn't be predicted or controlled. What do I do now? Mike said eventually, his voice thick, his eyes swollen, his body hunched in the posture of a man who'd been hit harder than any punch could hit. You fight, Kevin said. You fight because that's what Cus built you to do. And you fight the way he taught you, because the way he taught you is the best way. And you remember everything he said, because everything he said was for you. I can't do it without him. You can, because he's in you. Everything he taught you is in you. You carry him now, Mike, in your hands and your feet, in your head, in your heart. He's not gone. He just changed addresses. The metaphor was imperfect, and Kevin knew it, and Mike knew it, and neither of them had anything better to offer. Cus was gone. The house in Catskill would continue to exist. The gym would continue to operate. The fighters would continue to train. But the center was gone, the gravitational force that had held the system together, the mind that had designed the architecture and maintained it and corrected it when it drifted and reinforced it when it weakened. Kevin Rooney inherited the responsibility, not because he was ready, but he was as ready as anyone could be, because he was the only one left who understood the system from the inside, who'd been trained by Cus directly, who could speak the language that Cus had developed and that Mike understood at a level deeper than conscious comprehension. In the weeks following Cus' death, Kevin went through the house, not to clean it or organize it, but to preserve it, to catalog what Cus had left behind, the books and the notes and the training records and the correspondence that documented 50 years of boxing knowledge accumulated by a man who'd treated the study of fighting as a philosophical pursuit rather than a commercial enterprise. It was during this process, 3 weeks after Cus' death, that Kevin found the reel. He'd opened the top drawer of Cus' desk looking for an address book that he needed for the funeral arrangements. The drawer contained the usual detritus of an old man's desk: pens, paper clips, a pair of reading glasses with one cracked lens, stamps, a half-finished letter to a friend named Al that began, "Dear Al, I've been thinking about what you said regarding the left hook," and ended mid-sentence on the second page, and a small cardboard box containing a reel of Super 8 film, and an electricity bill with handwriting on the back. Kevin picked up the box. Read the label, WS Sparring, Full Contact, March 72. Recognized it immediately. The Bruce Lee tape. The tape he transported from Los Angeles to Catskill in his car a year ago. The tape Cus had watched alone in this room 3 times before writing his notes and putting it away. Kevin picked up the electricity bill. Turned it over. Read Cus' notes in the small, precise handwriting that Kevin knew as well as his own. Speed, beyond heavyweight classification. Possibly beyond any classification. Timing, anticipatory, not reactive. He moves before the opponent commits. Control, full contact, but never out of control. More dangerous than wild. The restraint at the end. Could have finished. Chose not to. Discipline of a master, not a brawler. And at the bottom, the line that stopped Kevin's breath. Show to Mike when he's ready. Not yet. Kevin held the electricity bill in one hand and the film box in the other. He stood in Cus' study, surrounded by Cus' books and Cus' files and the lingering smell of Cus' pipe tobacco, and felt the weight of a dead man's instruction settling on his shoulders. Show to Mike when he's ready. Not yet. When would Mike be ready? What did ready mean in Cus' vocabulary? Kevin knew Cus' mind better than almost anyone, but this instruction required interpretation, and interpretation of the dead was always uncertain, always haunted by the possibility of error. Cus wasn't here to clarify. Cus wasn't here to say now, or not now, or to explain the criteria by which readiness would be judged. Kevin put the reel back in the drawer, put the electricity bill beside it, closed the drawer, and decided to wait. He waited through 1986, while Mike Tyson became the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. November 22nd, 1986. The Hilton Hotel in Las Vegas. Trevor Berbick, the WBC champion, outweighed Mike by 15 pounds and was expected by some commentators to provide a serious test. Mike knocked him out in the second round. The knockout was not a single punch, but a combination. The peek boot defense slipping Berbick's jab, and the right hand detonating on Berbick's temple with a force that sent the champion stumbling across the ring on legs that had stopped receiving signals from his brain. Berbick went down, got up, went down again, got up again, and went down a third time, the referee stopping the fight while Berbick tried to stand on legs that wouldn't support him. Mike Tyson was 20 years old. He was the WBC heavyweight champion of the world. He was the youngest man to hold that title in the history of the sport. Kevin watched from the corner and thought about the reel in the drawer. Not yet. Mike was on top of the world, radiating the invincibility of youth and talent and the absolute conviction that nothing could stop him. Showing him the tape now would be like showing a forest fire match. Irrelevant. Mike wouldn't be able to see what Cus wanted him to see because Mike wasn't looking for what Cus wanted him to find. Kevin waited through 1987, the year of unification. March. Mike defeated James "Bone Crusher" Smith for the WBA title. The fight went the full 12 rounds, the first time anyone had survived that long against Tyson. And Kevin noted with interest that Mike seemed frustrated by the distance, irritated that Smith had survived by holding and clinching rather than fighting. Mike won the decision unanimously, but the experience of going 12 rounds without a knockout bothered him in a way that revealed something Cus would have noticed immediately. Mike expected to destroy everyone. Not just beat them, destroy them. When destruction didn't happen, when an opponent survived through strategy or durability or sheer stubbornness, Mike experienced not disappointment but confusion. As if the opponent's survival was a personal affront, a violation of the natural order, an error in the universe that needed correction. This expectation of destruction was, in Cus' framework, the seed of vulnerability. A fighter who expected to destroy was a fighter who didn't prepare for the alternative. And the alternative in heavyweight boxing always arrived eventually. Someone always survived. Someone always lasted long enough to make the fight complicated. And the fighter who couldn't handle complication, who'd built his identity on the assumption that complication wouldn't occur, was a fighter headed for a crisis. August 1987, Mike defeated Tony Tucker for the IBF title. Unanimous decision. 12 rounds. Another fight that went the distance. Another survival by the opponent. Another night where Mike won convincingly but didn't destroy, and the frustration was visible in his post-fight interviews, the tightness around his mouth, the clipped answers, the barely concealed irritation of a man who'd been denied the catharsis of a knockout. Mike was now the undisputed heavyweight champion. WBC, WBA, IBF. All three belts. The lineal champion. The man. At 21 years old, he held every title in the heavyweight division and had a record of 34 wins, 0 losses, 31 knockouts. He was, by any objective measure, the most dominant heavyweight since a young Muhammad Ali and the most feared puncher since a young George Foreman. He was also beginning to come apart. Kevin saw it, saw the cracks forming in the architecture that Cus had built. Not in the gym, where Mike's training remained ferocious and disciplined. The muscle memory of Cus' methods carrying him through sessions that replicated the structure Cus had established. In the gym, Mike was still the fighter Cus had made. The problems were outside the gym. Robbie Givens entered Mike's life with the precision of a guided missile. Beautiful, educated, articulate, she was everything Mike's Brownsville upbringing had taught him to desire, and nothing his Catskill education had prepared him to manage. Their relationship was volatile from the beginning, the chemistry between them generating heat without warmth, passion without partnership, the kind of connection that looked like love from the outside and felt like combat from the inside. Don King entered Mike's orbit with the gravitational inevitability of a planet capturing a moon. King was the most powerful promoter in boxing, a man whose career was built on the dual foundations of charisma and exploitation, who'd promoted Ali and Foreman and Frazier, and who saw in Mike Tyson the biggest payday in the history of the sport. King began the process of separating Mike from the people Cus had put around him, the slow, patient work of isolation that would eventually leave Mike alone in a room full of people who wanted his money but not his well-being. Kevin watched all of this and felt the urgency increasing. Mike needed something, not a training adjustment, not a tactical modification, something deeper, a recalibration of the internal compass that Cus had installed, and that the pressures of fame and money and toxic relationships were gradually demagnetizing. January 1988, Mike destroyed Larry Holmes. Fourth-round knockout. Holmes, the former champion, the man who'd held the title for 7 years, was 38 years old and past his prime, but still a legitimate heavyweight who'd been in the ring with the best of his era. Mike knocked him down in the fourth round with a right hand that Holmes later described as the hardest punch he'd ever received, and Holmes had received punches from Ernie Shavers, who was widely considered the hardest single-punch hitter in boxing history. March 1988, Mike destroyed Tony Tubbs. Second-round knockout. Tubbs was a former champion, a skilled boxer with quick hands and good movement, and Mike erased him in 2 rounds with a brutality that was impressive even by Tyson standards. After the Tubbs fight, Kevin sat in the house in Catskill and assessed. Mike was 34-0, 31 knockouts, undisputed champion, 21 years old, the most feared fighter in the world, possibly the most feared fighter in the history of the world. The numbers were unprecedented. The dominance was total. The destruction was absolute. And Mike was lost, not in the ring. In the ring, he was precisely where Cus had aimed him. But outside the ring, in a space where a man had to be more than a fighter, where the skills that won championships were insufficient and the skills that sustain a life were essential, Mike was drowning. The marriage to Givens was deteriorating. King's influence was increasing. The entourage was growing. A constellation of people who fed on Mike's wealth and fame and who provided nothing in return except the illusion of companionship. Mike was starting to believe in his own myth, not in his abilities, which were real and earned and justified by 34 fights and 31 knockouts. In the myth, the story that had been constructed around him by media and promoters and fans, the story that said Mike Tyson was invincible, unstoppable, a force of nature that couldn't be defeated by any human being. Cus had warned about this, had warned Kevin specifically. The moment a fighter believes he can't lose is the moment before he loses. Not because believing makes him weak, because believing makes him stop preparing for the possibility. And a fighter who hasn't prepared for adversity is a fighter who will be destroyed by adversity when it arrives. And it always arrives, Kevin. Always. Kevin went to the drawer, opened it. The reel and the electricity bill were where he'd left them 3 years ago. Undisturbed, patient, waiting. He picked up the electricity bill. Read the last line. Show to Mike when he's ready. Not yet. Kevin looked at the line for a long time. The handwriting of a dead man. The instruction of a teacher who'd thought of everything, who'd planned for everything, who'd even planned for his own absence by leaving notes for the people who would carry his work forward. Was Mike ready? Kevin asked himself the question and then asked it again and then asked it a third time, because the answer mattered and a wrong answer in either direction would waste what the reel contained. If Mike wasn't ready, showing him the tape would produce competitive aggression rather than humility. If Mike was ready, not showing him the tape would deprive him of the lesson at the moment he needed it most. Kevin thought about what ready meant in Cus vocabulary. Cus didn't use the word casually. Ready, for Cus, didn't mean capable. It meant receptive, ready to receive information without filtering it through ego. Ready to see something that challenged your self-concept and to absorb the challenge rather than reject it. Ready to be changed by what you saw. Was Mike ready to be changed? Was the 21-year-old undisputed champion, surrounded by people who told him he was invincible, married to a woman who was dismantling his emotional stability, courted by a promoter who wanted his body and his name, but not his growth? Was that man ready to sit in a dark room and watch a 135-pound martial artist move in ways that challenged the champion's understanding of his own supremacy? Kevin decided yes. Not because Mike was in an ideal state of receptivity. Because Mike was in the last state of receptivity he might occupy for a long time. The window was closing. Don King was pulling Mike away. Givens was pulling Mike apart. The entourage was filling every space where quiet reflection might occur. If Kevin didn't show Mike the tape now, while Kevin still had access, while Mike still came to Catskill, while the connection between them was still strong enough to support the weight of what the tape contained, the opportunity might not come again. Kevin picked up the phone, dialed Mike's number, waited through 4 rings. Yeah, Mike's voice. The public voice, the hard voice, the voice that said, I am the champion and you're not. Mike, come to the house. I need to show you something Cuz left for you. Silence on the line. The public voice evaporated instantly, replaced by the other voice, the private one, the voice of the boy Cuz had saved. Cuz left something for me. He did. Come to the house. Come alone. When? Tonight. Wednesday. Can you come tonight? I'll be there at 9. Kevin hung up, went to the drawer, took out the reel and the electricity bill, set up the projector in the living room, hung a white bedsheet on the wall because the living room wall was dark painted and wouldn't reflect the projected image clearly. Positioned 2 chairs in front of the sheet, 6 feet back, the viewing distance that Cuz had calculated for optimal focus. Then he sat down and waited for the most dangerous man in the world to come home and meet the ghost that Cuz had left for him. Mike Tyson arrived at the house in Catskill at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday evening in March 1988. He came alone, which was unusual. In those days, Tyson rarely went anywhere without an entourage, handlers, hangers-on, the inevitable constellation of people that orbited a 21-year-old with $100 million and the heavyweight championship of the world. But Kevin had said come alone, and Kevin was one of the 3 or 4 people alive whose instructions Tyson still followed without argument. The other 2 or 3 had been Cuz. And Cuz was gone. The drive from New York City to Catskill took 2 hours on a good night, north on the thruway, through the darkness of the Hudson Valley, past the exits for towns that Mike had never visited and never would, the geography of upstate New York scrolling past his windows like a film strip of someone else's life. Mike drove a black Mercedes, the kind of car that 21-year-old heavyweight champions drove in 1988, the kind of car that announced its driver's status before the driver stepped out. The car was too much for the roads of Catskill. The way Mike was too much for most spaces he occupied, the excess of function not of choice, but of proportion. Mike Tyson was built on a scale that made ordinary environments feel undersized. He'd driven this route hundreds of times. From 13 to 19, the road between Catskill and the world had been the road between home and everywhere else. Catskill was where Cuz lived, which meant Catskill was where Mike lived, which meant Catskill was home in a way that no other place had ever been or would ever be. The apartment in Brownsville, where Mike had grown up, if you could call it growing up, had been a place of survival, not habitation. The juvenile detention facility in Tryon had been a cage with educational programming. The apartments and houses Mike had acquired since becoming champion were real estate, investments, places where he kept his things and sometimes slept. Catskill was home. The Victorian house with its creaking floors and its gym on the first floor and Cuz study on the second floor, and the smell, the particular smell of old wood and pipe tobacco and leather and sweat, and the indefinable sin of a place where important things had happened. That smell was home. Mike could have navigated the house blindfolded, could have walked from the front door to the gym to the kitchen to his old bedroom with his eyes closed and his hands at his sides, guided by the spatial memory that the body retained when the mind had moved on. He parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, sat in the car for a moment, the silence of the Catskill night pressing against the windows. The silence here was different from the silence of the city. In the city, silence was the absence of noise, a gap between sounds, temporary and unstable. In Catskill, silence was a substance. It had weight and texture and permanence. The silence of the countryside, of the mountains, of a place where human activity was the exception rather than the rule. Mike got out of the car. The night air hit him, cold, March cold, the kind of cold that upstate New York produced even as the calendar insisted that spring was approaching. He was wearing a leather jacket over a black t-shirt, jeans, sneakers, the casual uniform of a man who didn't need to dress to impress because his physical presence did the impressing for him. 5'10", 218 pounds, neck 19.5 inches around. The proportions of a man who'd been designed by nature for a specific purpose and who'd been refined by training into the most efficient expression of that purpose. He walked to the front door. It was unlocked, which meant Kevin was inside and expecting him. Mike pushed it open and stepped into the house and felt, immediately and overwhelmingly, the presence of Cuz. Not literally. Cuz was dead. had been dead for 2 years and 4 months. But the house held him the way a church held its patron saint, not in physical form, but in the accumulated evidence of a life lived intensely within its walls. The books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls, fighters in black and white, posed and in action, the visual history of Cus' career. The coat racked by the door that still held one of Cus' jackets, a gray wool thing that Kevin hadn't been able to bring himself to remove. The smell. The pipe tobacco that had saturated the wood and the fabric of the house so thoroughly that 2 years of absence hadn't diminished it. "This house still smells like Cus," Mike said to no one, to the house itself, to the ghost that lived in its walls and its floors and its persistent tobacco-scented air. Kevin was in the living room. Mike walked through the hallway, past the gym door, past the kitchen, into the living room where Kevin sat in one of 2 chairs that had been positioned facing the far wall. The far wall was covered with a white bedsheet, hung from nails that Kevin had hammered in that afternoon, the fabric smooth and flat, a makeshift screen. On a table between the 2 chairs sat a projector. The Bell and Howell unit, borrowed from the neighbor, the same machine that Cus had used 4 years ago. Beside the projector, a small cardboard box. And beside the box, a piece of paper. Mike took in the scene with the rapid environmental assessment that Cus had trained into him. 2 chairs, a projector, a screen, something to watch. Kevin's face, serious but not alarmed. The expression of a man about to do something significant rather than something urgent. "What is this?" Mike asked. Kevin looked at him. "Something Cus wanted you to see. He left a note. Said to show you when you were ready." The effect of Cus' name on Mike Tyson was immediate and visible. The public face, the champion's face, the face that showed the world nothing except confidence and menace, dissolved. What replaced it was younger, softer, more vulnerable. The face of a boy who'd lost his father and who still, 2 years later, hadn't fully processed the loss, because processing it would require accepting it, and accepting it would require admitting that the one person who'd made the world navigable was permanently gone. "Cus left this for me. He watched it in 1984. Made notes. Said to show you when you were ready. I think you're ready now." Mike looked at the chairs, the projector, the sheet on the wall. Then he sat down. Didn't ask what was on the film. Didn't ask why Cus had saved it. Didn't ask what ready meant or why Kevin had determined that the time was now. If Cus had left something for him, Mike would receive it the way he'd received everything Cus had given him. With trust. With the absolute, unquestioning faith of a boy who'd been saved by an old man and who'd never stopped believing that the old man knew things he didn't. Kevin sat in the other chair. Picked up the piece of paper from the table. Held out to Mike. "These are the notes Cus made after he watched it. He wrote them on the back of an electricity bill. It was the only paper he had." Mike took the paper. His hands, the hands that generated the most devastating punching power in heavyweight boxing. The hands that had knocked out 31 professional fighters. The hands that had broken orbital bones and dislocated jaws and rendered 240-pound men unconscious in fractions of seconds. Held the electricity bill with the care of a man holding a letter from the dead. He turned it over. Read the handwriting. Cus' handwriting. Small, precise, the penmanship of a generation that valued legibility. Mike knew this handwriting, had seen it on training notes and fight plans, and the small cards Cus left on Mike's pillow when Mike was a teenager. Cards that said things like, "Discipline is doing what you don't want to do when you don't want to do it, and fear is your friend if you control it and your master if you don't." Mike read the notes slowly. His lips moved slightly, the way they did when he was processing something important. The residual habit of a boy who'd learned to read late and who still occasionally sub-vocalized when the words mattered enough to require the reinforcement of physical articulation. Speed, beyond heavyweight classification. Possibly beyond any classification. Timing, anticipatory, not reactive. He moves before the opponent commits. Control, full contact, but never out of control. More dangerous than wild. The restraint at the end. Could have finished. Chose not to. Discipline of a master, not a brawler. Mike read the notes twice. Then he read the last line, the line at the bottom, separated from the technical observations by space that suggested the writer had paused before adding it. Show to Mike when he's ready. Not yet. Mike stared at the line. The words blurred slightly, the moisture in his eyes refracting the lamplight, the tears that he would not allow to fall, but that he could not prevent from forming. Show to Mike when he's ready. Cus I've been thinking about him. Even while watching someone else's fighting, someone else's brilliance, Cus had been thinking about Mike, had been planning for Mike's development, had been making decisions about when and how to deliver information that would serve Mike's growth. Even in death, Cus was training him. He was thinking about me, Mike said. The words were quiet, stripped of the public voice, stripped of the champion's bravado, delivered in the register that only people who'd known Mike before the fame ever heard. The boy's voice. The voice from Brownsville that lisped slightly on sibilance and that carried, beneath its softness, the particular tenderness of a person who'd learned early that love was unreliable and who therefore treasured every evidence of it with the desperate gratitude of someone who knew how rare it was. He was always thinking about you, Kevin said. Mike held the electricity bill a moment longer. Then he set it on the table, next to the projector, next to the box that contained the reel. He looked at the white sheet on the wall, the blank surface that was about to become a window into a room in Hong Kong, 16 years ago, where a dead man moved. Play it, Mike said. Kevin threaded the film into the projector. The mechanical process was deliberate, the film threading through the gate and around the sprockets with the tactile precision that 8mm projection required. One wrong loop, and the film would jam. One misaligned sprocket, and the image would shudder and jump. Kevin had practiced the threading that afternoon, running the film through and back twice, making sure the image would be stable when the moment came. He turned off the living room lamp. The room went dark, the only light the faint glow from the hallway and the ambient illumination of a Catskill night filtering through the curtained windows. Kevin pressed the projector's power switch. The lamp inside the unit ignited, throwing a beam of light through the lens and onto the bedsheet, a rectangle of white light in the darkness. The mechanism engaged, the film began to move, and the room filled with the sound of the projector, the rhythmic mechanical stutter of celluloid passing through the gate at 18 frames per second, a sound like a small, precise heart beating. The countdown frames appeared on the sheet, numbers in circles, ticking backward. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. The numbers were slightly off-center, the framing not quite perfect, the amateur quality of the footage establishing itself before the content appeared. Then the image. A room. Wooden floors. A heavy bag visible at the edge of the frame. Mirrors on one wall, reflecting the room back on itself. Windows with light coming through them. The light of a Hong Kong afternoon, warm and slightly golden. A wooden structure against one wall, something with arms projecting from it, a training device of some kind that Mike didn't recognize. And two men standing in the center of the room. Mike leaned forward. The first man was shirtless. Small. Even on the grainy, imperfect 8mm footage, projected onto a bedsheet in a dark room in upstate New York, the man's size was immediately apparent. He was lean to the point of appearing carved, every muscle defined, the anatomy visible beneath the skin with the precision of an illustration. But the frame was small. The shoulders were not broad. The arms, though muscular, were not thick. The overall impression was a man built for speed and precision rather than power, a racing vehicle rather than a freight train. He's tiny, Mike said. The words were not contemptuous. They were surprised. Cus had saved this film. Cus had watched it 3 times. Cus had written notes that used phrases like beyond any classification and discipline of a master. Cus did not use those phrases lightly. Cus did not use those phrases about anyone Mike had ever heard him discuss. And Mike had heard Cus discuss every great fighter of the 20th century in detail that would have exhausted a doctoral committee. For Cus to apply those phrases to a man this small meant that what was about to happen on this bedsheet was something extraordinary. The second man was in a dark t-shirt. Shorter than the first, stockier, built with the compact density of a man who carried his power close to his center. Both men had dark hair. Both men had the posture of fighters, the settled, grounded quality that came from years of training the body to be ready for sudden movement from a position of apparent stillness. They bowed to each other. Quick nods. The kind of acknowledgment that happened between people who knew each other well enough to skip ceremony. Then they settled into their stances. Mike studied the shirtless man's stance with the analytical eye that Cus had spent 6 years developing. Mike Tyson was not just a puncher. He was a student. Cus had made sure of that, requiring Mike to watch hundreds of hours of boxing film, teaching him to read fighters the way a scholar read texts, to identify patterns and tendencies and weaknesses from visual evidence alone. Mike could watch 30 seconds of a boxer's footage and tell you which hand he favored, which direction he circled, how he reacted to pressure, what his habits were when he was tired. This man's stance was not a boxing stance. The hands were wrong by boxing standards. Not up, not protecting the face, not positioned in the peekaboo guard that Mike used, or the high guard that most heavyweights used, or any guard configuration that Mike recognized from his exhaustive study of boxing technique. The lead hand was extended at chest height, fingers open or loosely closed, the arm forming a bridge between the man and his opponent. The rear hand was near the chest, lower than any boxing trainer would accept, the chin exposed above it. His hands are low, Mike said. Anyone could hit him. Keep watching, Kevin said. The second man moved first, forward toward the shirtless man with a steady, pressured advance that Mike recognized instinctively because it was the kind of advance Mike himself used. Forward pressure, closing distance, making the other man deal with your presence in his space. Mike used this approach because his body was built for it, because his short arms required close range and his power required proximity. This man in the dark t-shirt was using it for different reasons Mike didn't understand, but the principle was the same. Walk forward. Make them deal with you. The shirtless man retreated, not backing up in a straight line, which was what panic fighters did. Moving at angles, changing the geometry of the space between them, each step creating a new alignment that forced the advancing man to adjust. The footwork was not boxing footwork, the side-to-side movement of a man working behind a jab. It was something else, more fluid, more multidirectional. The man seemed to be sliding across the floor rather than stepping, his weight transferring with a smoothness that made the movement look effortless, and that Mike, who knew exactly how difficult effortless movement was, recognized as the product of thousands of hours of practice. Then the shirtless man kicked the other man's leg. Mike Tyson had never, in his professional career or his extensive study of fighting, considered the leg as a striking weapon used against another leg. He'd been kicked, as a child, in street fights, the clumsy, untrained kicks of boys who were imitating what they'd seen in martial arts movies. Those kicks were irrelevant to his understanding of fighting. They were slow, telegraphed, easy to avoid, and inconsequential when they landed. This kick was not irrelevant. The shirtless man's right leg moved with a speed and precision that was mechanical in its efficiency. The shin, not the foot, connected with the outside of the advancing man's lead thigh in a short, chopping motion that traveled perhaps 18 inches. The sound of the impact was audible even on the 8mm film's limited audio. A dense thud, the sound of conditioned bone meeting muscle at speed. The advancing man's leg buckled. His forward pressure interrupted. His rhythm broken. One kick, delivered in less than half a second, and the dynamic of the exchange had changed. What the fuck was that? Mike said. Kevin said nothing. Cus' instruction had been to show Mike the film, not to explain it. The explanation, if one was needed, would come from the film itself. The exchange continued. The two men entered close range, and Mike's attention intensified because close range was his domain, the distance at which he operated, the space where his skills were most lethal and his understanding most complete. In close range, he could read fighters the way a musician read sheet music, every movement a note in a composition he knew by heart. The man in the dark t-shirt threw a series of rapid straight punches, one after another, each following the line of the one before it, the hands cycling with a speed that was impressive by any standard. Multiple punches, fast, targeted at the center line of the shirtless man's body, the cumulative effect designed to overwhelm rather than devastate. The shirtless man absorbed 2 or 3 of the punches on his body, and then did something that Mike would replay in his mind for years. The straight lead. Mike saw the shirtless man's hand in its guard position, the left hand extended at chest height. Then he saw the hand at the other man's chin, the contact point visible in the subtle snap of the dark shirt man's head. But the movement between guard and chin, the transit of the fist through space was not there. Mike's eyes, which had been trained by Cus to track punches, which could see hooks and uppercuts and jabs from fighters who threw them at the highest professional speed, which could pick up the micro-movements that preceded a punch and react to them before the punch was fully launched, Mike's eyes could not track this movement. The fist was here. The fist was there. The space between here and there was empty. Mike sat back in his chair. The movement was involuntary, physical, his body reacting to the visual information before his mind had processed it. He sat back the way you sat back when something surprised you, the way you flinched from an unexpected movement, the way a fighter slipped a punch he hadn't seen coming, but that his reflexes had detected through some channel below conscious awareness. Kevin watched Mike's reaction in the projector's flickering light, saw the backward lean, saw the expression change, saw the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, the man who'd knocked out 31 professional fighters, the man whose speed was considered supernatural by the standards of his sport, react to a movement on a bedsheet the way fighters reacted to punches they couldn't track. Mike said nothing. The commentary that had started when the image appeared, the observations about size and stance and hand position, had stopped. The projector's mechanical heartbeat filled the silence, steady and persistent, the only sound in the room besides the breathing of two men watching a ghost fight. The second round began. The shirtless man changed tactics, moving forward now, initiating rather than responding. The combination that opened the round was 3 techniques delivered in approximately 1 second. A low kick, the same leg attack Mike had seen in the first round. Then the straight lead, the invisible punch. Then a hook to the body, a short, curved strike that followed the straight, lead the way a period followed a sentence. 3 techniques. 1 second. On the 8mm film, at 18 frames per second, the combination occupied maybe 18 frames. 18 individual images to contain 3 distinct fighting techniques, each one delivered with full force to a separate target on the opponent's body. The arithmetic was staggering. 6 frames per technique. 1/3 of a second per technique. The combination didn't look like 3 things. It looked like one thing. One continuous flow of movement that started at the opponent's leg and ended at the opponent's ribs, the individual techniques bleeding into each other with no gaps, no resets, no spaces between. Mike was leaning forward now. The initial shock had been processed, and the analytical mind that Cus had built was engaging. Mike was studying the film the way Cus had taught him to study film, looking not just at what the fighter did, but how he did it, the underlying mechanics that produced the visible result. The sweep that ended the second round put the dark shirt man on the floor. The shirtless man's leg hooked behind the other man's ankle, a simple mechanical action, a lever applied to a fulcrum, and the other man went down. He landed on his side, caught himself, looked up, and the shirtless man stepped back. Mike saw the step back and his face changed. Not the way it had changed when the straight lead was invisible. That change had been shock, the involuntary response to something unexpected. This change was something else. Recognition. The recognition of something he understood at a level deeper than technique, deeper than tactics, deeper than the analytical framework Cus had installed. Mike Tyson was a finisher. The defining characteristic of his fighting style, the quality that separated him from every other heavyweight of his era, was his ability and his compulsion to finish hurt opponents. When a man went down in front of Mike Tyson, Mike did not step back. Mike swarmed. Mike descended on the fallen man with the focused, relentless violence of a force of nature, punching from angles that the fallen man couldn't anticipate, with a speed the fallen man couldn't react to until the referee intervened or the fallen man stopped moving. This was not cruelty. It was Cus' design. Cus had built the finishing instinct into Mike's technical and psychological architecture because Cus understood that heavyweight fights were won in the moments after a knockdown, that the fighter who could capitalize on his opponent's vulnerability with immediate, overwhelming force was the fighter who won championships. The finishing instinct was one of Mike's greatest weapons. It was also, in a sense, a limitation. Because Mike didn't choose to finish. Mike finished the way a river flowed downhill. Automatically. Inevitably. Without conscious decision. The shirtless man on the film had his opponent on the floor. The opponent was vulnerable. The finish was available. And a shirtless man chose not to take it. Stepped back. Gave space. Waited. Let his opponent stand. And then continued the fight on equal terms. Mike watched this and recognized something that Cus had been trying to teach him for 6 years. Something Cus had articulated in 100 different ways, in 1,000 different conversations, in the training notes and the cards on Mike's pillow, and the late-night talks in Cus' study where the old man and the young fighter discussed not just boxing, but the nature of fighting and the nature of control and the nature of the self that did the fighting and the controlling. The measure of a fighter is not what he can do, but what he chooses not to do, Cus had said. Mike remembered the words, had heard them many times, had understood them intellectually the way a student understood a theorem, as an abstract principle that was true in theory, but that didn't connect to the visceral reality of standing over a hurt man with your fists loaded and every cell in your body screaming, "Finish him." On this bedsheet, in this dark room, the abstract principle was embodied. The shirtless man could have finished, chose not to, not because he lacked the ability, not because he was afraid, not because the fight was staged or the contact was controlled. The contact was real. The opponent was genuinely hurt. The finish was genuinely available. And the shirtless man chose, in a moment, at full speed, under the pressure of real combat, to exercise a quality of control that Mike had never seen in any fighter, in any discipline, in any film Cus had ever shown him. This was what Cus wanted him to see. Not the speed, not the kicks, not the techniques that existed outside boxing's vocabulary. The control, the restraint, the ability to destroy, and the choice not to. The third round began, and Mike stopped moving entirely. He was no longer leaning forward or sitting back or shifting in his chair. He was still, the absolute stillness of a man whose entire attention was consumed by what was in front of him, every perceptual resource allocated to the images on the bedsheet. The third round was fast, faster than the first two rounds, the way real fights got faster when both participants had tested each other and determined that the testing was over and the real work was beginning. The two men on the film exchanged techniques with a speed and fluidity that the 8mm camera struggled to capture, the movements blurring between frames, the image sometimes showing two positions simultaneously because the body had moved during the frame's exposure time. The combination in the middle of the round was the most complex thing on the film. Mike counted the techniques because counting was how Cus had taught him to analyze combinations. Count the individual actions, assess their targets, evaluate their efficiency. Low kick, straight lead. Then the shirtless man's hands changed, doing something Mike had never seen in boxing. Instead of retracting after the straight lead to reload for the next punch, the hand stayed forward and engaged with the opponent's arms, controlling them, trapping them, pressing one arm against the opponent's chest and pinning it there. With the arm pinned, the shirtless man delivered an elbow strike. The elbow traveled maybe 6 inches, a short, curved motion that ended at the opponent's solar plexus. In boxing, the elbow was a foul, a disqualification offense, an illegal weapon that referees watched for and penalized when it appeared. In this room, on this film, in whatever discipline the shirtless man practiced, the elbow was not a foul. It was a tool, a weapon in a vast arsenal that included tools Mike's training had never addressed. Mike saw the elbow and felt something shift inside his understanding. Not a dramatic shift, not a collapse, a tectonic movement, deep and slow, the kind of shift that rearranged foundations without disturbing surfaces. He was seeing, for the first time in his professional life, a fighter who possessed weapons that Mike did not possess and could not counter with the tools his training had given him. Kicks, elbows, the trapping that controlled the opponent's limbs, the sweeps that removed the opponent's base. These were not boxing techniques. They existed outside the vocabulary that Cus had given Mike, the comprehensive, brilliant, deep vocabulary of peekaboo boxing that had been sufficient for every opponent Mike had faced. Sufficient. The word arrived in Mike's mind with the force of a revelation. Cus boxing had been sufficient. It had beaten everyone. It had made Mike the youngest heavyweight champion in history. It had produced 34 victories and 31 knockouts. It was sufficient, but sufficient was not complete. The distinction mattered. Sufficient meant adequate for the challenges encountered. Complete meant adequate for all possible challenges. Mike's boxing was sufficient because the challenges he'd encountered were all boxing challenges. But the film on the bedsheet showed a different kind of challenge. A fighter who operated in dimensions that boxing didn't address, who attacked targets that boxing didn't protect, who used weapons that boxing didn't recognize. In a boxing ring, with boxing rules, Mike would destroy the shirtless man. Mike outweighed him by 80 pounds. Mike's power would overwhelm the smaller man's structure. The boxing ring would neutralize the kicks and the elbows and the trapping, because the rules would forbid them. And without them, the shirtless man would be a small man with fast hands fighting the most powerful heavyweight alive. The outcome would not be in doubt. But this film wasn't a boxing match. This film was a fight. No rules. No ring. No referee. Just two men and the totality of what they knew. And in that context, the shirtless man had tools that Mike didn't. had dimensions that Mike hadn't known existed, had a vocabulary of violence that made Mike's vocabulary, however comprehensive within its domain, feel like one chapter in a book that had many chapters he hadn't read. The sidekick that ended the third round folded the dark shirt man like a closing book. The shirtless man's foot drove into the other man's midsection with a linear thrust that Mike recognized, with the instinct of a fighter, as genuinely powerful. Not movie powerful, not demonstration powerful, the kind of powerful that rearranged the internal organs of the person receiving it. The dark shirt man bent forward over the kick, his body curling around the impact point, his air leaving him in a sound that the film's audio captured as a sharp bark. The shirtless man could have finished. Again, the second time in the fight that the opponent was hurt enough to be ended. The second opportunity to demonstrate the superiority that his skills clearly established. He stepped back. Again, gave space. Again, waited. Again. The dark shirt man recovered. Raised his hand. Stop. Enough. They embraced. The real embrace. The fighter's embrace. The brief, tight, whole-body contact of two men who tested each other and found each other worthy. Then the shirtless man walked to the camera. His face filled the frame. Sweat, the sheen of exertion, the skin luminous in the window light. Eyes looking into the lens. Looking through the lens. Looking across 16 years and 8,000 miles at a young man sitting in a dark room in upstate New York. The eyes were calm. Not the calm of exhaustion, though the man was clearly winded. The calm of a person who had just performed at the maximum of his capacity and who was entirely at peace with what that maximum contained. No wideness, no residual aggression. No need to prove anything to the camera or to the future viewers he couldn't know existed. Just presence. Total, undiluted presence. The faint smile. The corner of the mouth rising by a fraction. The private expression of a man who is satisfied with what had just occurred. Then the hand reached for the button. The image shook. The film ended. The projector threw white light on the bedsheet, the empty rectangle of illumination filling the space where the image had been. The projector's mechanism continued its rhythmic stutter, the reels turning, the gate empty, the light passing through nothing on its way to the sheet. The sound filled the room, mechanical and persistent, the heartbeat of a machine that didn't know its content was exhausted. Kevin didn't turn off the projector, didn't move, didn't speak. He sat in his chair and waited for Mike Tyson to respond to what he'd just seen. Mike sat in his chair, hands on his knees, eyes on the white rectangle of light, where, moments ago, a dead man had looked at him with eyes that saw everything and feared nothing. His face was unreadable, not because the expression was controlled, but because the expression was too complex for a single reading. Not shock, not awe, not the competitive aggression that Kevin had feared, the response that would have said, I could beat him, and would have meant that the lesson was lost. Something else, something deeper and quieter and more permanent. The silence lasted a long time. A minute, 2 minutes. In the presence of Mike Tyson, who was not a quiet man, who filled rooms with his energy the way the sun filled rooms with light, 2 minutes of silence was extraordinary. Kevin had trained Mike for 3 years, had spent thousands of hours in his company, had never experienced Mike Tyson sitting in complete silence for 2 full minutes. Played again, Mike said. Kevin rewound the film. The projector whirred, the reels reversing, the mechanical process taking perhaps 90 seconds. Then the film was at the beginning, the countdown frames ready to count down again. The room in Hong Kong, waiting to appear on a bedsheet again. Kevin pressed play. Mike watched differently the second time. Kevin could see the change in his posture, the shift from viewer to analyst, the engagement of the boxing mind that Cus had built. Mike leaned closer to the bedsheet, his face perhaps 4 feet from the projected image, his eyes tracking the movement with the focused intensity of a predator studying prey, except that the predator wasn't looking for weakness. The predator was looking for understanding. Mike studied the footwork. The shirtless man's feet moved in patterns that were not boxing patterns, but Mike could see the principles underlying the patterns. Angle-Kreisschern, distance management, balance maintenance during transitions. These were boxing principles expressed through a different physical vocabulary, the way the same mathematical theorem could be expressed in different notations. The notation was foreign. The math was familiar. Mike studied the timing. This was where his analytical mind, trained by Cus to a sharpness that most boxers never achieved, produced its most significant observation. The shirtless man didn't counterpunch in the way that boxers counterpunched. Boxers waited for the opponent's punch to arrive, slipped or blocked it, and then threw their own punch into the opening the opponent's punch had created. Defense then offense. Two actions, sequential. The shirtless man didn't do this. The shirtless man hit his opponent while the opponent was still committing to his own technique. Not after the technique arrived. During its delivery. The timing was anticipatory rather than reactive. The shirtless man reading the initiation of the opponent's movement and launching his own movement to arrive first. He was intercepting the attack before it was complete. This concept, interception, existed in boxing, but at a lower level of execution than what the film showed. Boxers who could time their opponents, who could throw a counter simultaneously with the opponent's attack, were considered elite. The shirtless man was doing something beyond elite. He was reading intention rather than action, responding to the decision to attack rather than the attack itself. And his response arrived so early in the opponent's movement that the opponent's technique was disrupted before it was fully formed. Mike studied the hips. This observation was technical, specific, the kind of detail that only a fighter who understood power generation at a deep level would notice. The shirtless man generated his striking power through hip rotation, the pelvis turning into each strike, the force originating in the ground and traveling through the legs and through the hip rotation and into the arm or leg that delivered the technique. This was identical to boxing's power generation mechanism. Identical. The source was the same. The pathway was the same. The principle was the same. Mike knew this principle intimately because it was the principle that made his own power possible. Mike Tyson at 5'10 and 218 hit harder than men who were 6'4 and 250 because Mike's hip rotation was perfect, the torque generated by his lower body transferring into his punches with an efficiency that added 50 pounds of effective impact force to every shot he threw. Cus had spent years perfecting Mike's hip mechanics, and the result was the most devastating punching power the heavyweight division had seen since Ernie Shavers. The shirtless man used the same mechanics at 135 pounds. The force differential was enormous. Mike's mass producing far greater absolute force than the shirtless man's mass could generate. But the efficiency was the same. The principle was the same. And the speed of the hip rotation, the velocity at which the shirtless man's pelvis turned into his strikes, was faster than anything Mike had ever seen. Faster than his own. Faster than any heavyweights. Faster than any fighters at any weight class in any footage Mike had studied in 6 years of film analysis under Cus' tutelage. The shirtless man was doing what Mike did, but faster. With less mass, obviously. With less absolute power, necessarily. But the speed of execution, the rate at which the kinetic chain fired, the velocity of the hip turn that drove the strikes, was in a category Mike hadn't known existed. Mike studied the relaxation. This was the observation that took the longest to form, because it required watching the shirtless man, not during his techniques, but between them, in the gaps, in the moments of non-action that separated one technique from the next. And what Mike saw in those moments contradicted everything his experience had shown him about fighting at high intensity. The shirtless man was relaxed. Not partially relaxed. Not moderately relaxed. Completely relaxed. Between techniques, his muscles showed no visible tension. His shoulders were down, not raised. His arms were loose, not rigid. His jaw was unclenched. His breathing was deep and rhythmic rather than shallow and rapid. He was, in the moments between violence, as relaxed as a man sitting in a chair reading a newspaper. Then, at the moment of a technique's execution, everything changed. The relaxation vanished. The muscles engaged with explosive totality, every fiber contracting simultaneously, the full force of the body concentrating into the striking surface for the fraction of a second that contact required. And then, immediately after contact, the relaxation returned. The muscles released. The tension evaporated. The body returned to its resting state as if the technique had never happened. Relaxation. Explosion. Relaxation. The cycle was seamless, the transitions instantaneous. The contrast between the resting state and the active state so extreme that it looked like two different people occupying the same body, a sleeping man and a detonation sharing the same frame. Mike knew this principle, because I taught it to him using different words. Relax until the moment of impact. Tension before impact slows you down. Tension after impact wastes energy. The punch is a whip, not a push. A whip is loose until the tip cracks, and then it's loose again. Mike had internalized this principle. His punching was loose and fast and explosive precisely because Cus had drilled the relaxation-explosion-relaxation cycle into his neuromuscular system until it was automatic. But watching the shirtless man on the film, Mike could see the principle executed at a level that exceeded his own. The shirtless man's relaxation was deeper. His explosion was sharper. The transition between the two states was faster. The cycle operated at a frequency that Mike's training had approached but not reached. Cus had seen this. Cus had written "more dangerous than wild" on the electricity bill. And now Mike understood what Cus meant. Wild fighting was dangerous because it was unpredictable, because the wild fighter threw everything without calculation, because the volume of output overwhelmed the opponent's ability to process and respond. But wild fighting was also inefficient. Energy was wasted. Techniques were imprecise. The wild fighter tired himself as much as he tired his opponent. This man was not wild. This man was the opposite of wild. Every technique was precise. Every movement was calculated. Every expenditure of energy was exactly sufficient for its purpose. No more, no less. And yet the output was devastating. Not despite the control, but because of it. The control meant that nothing was wasted, that every ounce of the man's physical capacity was directed toward the target with mechanical efficiency, that the relatively small engine of a 135-pound body produced results that seemed disproportionate to its size. More dangerous than wild. Controlled destruction. The surgeon, not the hurricane. Mike reached the moment he'd been waiting for without knowing he'd been waiting for it. The straight lead in the first round. He'd seen it once, and his body had reacted before his mind could process. Now, on the second viewing, his analytical mind was prepared. "Stop," Mike said. "Rewind that." The punch. Kevin stopped the projector. Rewound. A few seconds of mechanical whirring, the image blurring backward on the bedsheet. Kevin released the rewind and pressed play. The moment approached. The dark shirt man throwing his rapid straight punches. The shirtless man covering, absorbing. And then the straight lead. Mike watched with everything Cus had given him. Every perceptual skill. Every analytical tool. Every microsecond of attention that his trained eyes could generate. He watched the way he watched opponents in the ring. The way he tracked punches from the fastest heavyweights alive. The way he read the tiny movements of shoulder and hip and foot that preceded a punch and that allowed him to move his head before the punch arrived. He could not see the straight lead. The hand was in guard position. The hand was at the chin. The middle was gone. "Again," Mike said. Kevin rewound. Played. Mike watched. Guard position. Chin. Nothing between. Again. Kevin rewound. Played. Mike watched. This time he didn't watch the hand. He watched the hip, the shoulder, the foot, the micro movements that would telegraph the punch's initiation. Every punch had a telegraph. Every punch, no matter how fast, began with a preparatory movement somewhere in a body, a weight shift or a shoulder turn or a hip rotation that preceded the arm's extension by milliseconds. Cus had taught Mike to read these telegraphs, and Mike could read them from fighters who threw punches at professional heavyweight speed. The telegraphs were how Mike's defense worked. See the preparation. Move the head. Let the punch pass through the space where the head had been. The shirtless man had no telegraph. No shoulder turn before the punch. No hip rotation before the punch. No weight shift before the punch. The punch seemed to originate from stillness, from the resting state of the relaxed body, without any preparatory movement that would announce its coming. One frame, stillness. Next frame, contact. The punch materialized rather than traveled. Mike knew this was an illusion. Knew that the limitations of the 8mm camera at 18 frames per second were responsible for some of the invisibility. At 24 frames per second, or at the 60 frames per second that modern slow-motion cameras would eventually achieve, the punch would be visible. The telegraph would be detectable. The preparation would be captured. But Mike also knew, with the certainty of a man who'd spent 6 years learning to see punches, that the camera's limitations were not the whole explanation. The telegraph was minimal. The preparation was minimal. The punch was, even accounting for the camera's frame rate, genuinely faster than what Mike's trained eyes could track. And Mike's eyes were the best in boxing. The eyes that saw Trevor Berbick's right hand coming and moved his head 2 inches to the left and let the punch sail past and then countered with the right hand that ended Berbick's career. The eyes that tracked Larry Holmes's jab, the jab that had been the best in heavyweight boxing for a decade, and found the gaps in it and exploited them systematically until Holmes was on the canvas in the fourth round. Those eyes could not see this punch. "I can't see it," Mike said. His voice was quiet, not frustrated, not angry, quiet with the particular hush that accompanied the recognition of something genuinely beyond one's capacity. "I literally cannot see the punch." Kevin said nothing. There was nothing to say. The punch was invisible on the film, and it would be invisible on the 10th viewing, and it would be invisible forever. Because whatever the shirtless man had done to eliminate the telegraph and accelerate the delivery and compress the travel time into a window smaller than 1/18 of a second was beyond the reach of the recording technology and beyond the reach of the viewing technology of the best eyes in professional boxing. Mike sat back. The analytical mode that had driven the second viewing receded, replaced by something broader, something that processed the totality of what he'd seen rather than the individual components. He'd dissected the techniques. He'd studied the mechanics. He'd identified the principles that were familiar and the principles that were foreign. He'd attempted to see the fastest punch on the film and failed. Now, he sat with the sum of these observations and let them combine into a single understanding. The projector reached the end of the film for the second time. The image disappeared. The white light returned. The mechanical heartbeat of the empty projector filled the room. Kevin reached over and turned off the projector. The room went dark. Truly dark, the darkness of a house in the country at night, without streetlights or ambient urban glow, just the faint luminescence from the hallway and the windows and the two men sitting in chairs in front of a bedsheet that had, moments ago, contained a dead man's ghost. The silence was complete. No projected heartbeat, no film movement, no mechanical sound of any kind, just the old house settling around them, the creak of wood and the whisper of the heating system and the vast, indifferent quiet of a Catskill night. Kevin looked at Mike. In the darkness, Mike's shape was visible as a dense shadow, the mass of him apparent even without light. The physical presence of 218 pounds of heavyweight champion occupying space with the gravitational certainty that very large, very dangerous men always occupied space. Kevin asked the question. It was the question that the entire journey of the film from Hong Kong to Los Angeles to Catskill had been building toward. The question that everyone who knew about the film wanted answered. The question that was, in one sense, absurd because it asked for a comparison between two men from different eras, different weight classes, different disciplines, different worlds. And in another sense, the question was the only question that mattered because it was the question that every person who'd ever watched a great fighter perform instinctively asked. How would he do against the best? Could you beat him? The question hung in the dark room. Kevin's voice had been steady when he asked it, the voice of a trainer posing a tactical question to his fighter, the same voice he used when he asked Mike about game plans and strategies and the strengths and weaknesses of upcoming opponents. But the question was not a tactical question. It was something larger and more personal. It was asking Mike Tyson, the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, the most feared fighter of his generation, to assess his own capabilities against a man who existed only on 16-year-old celluloid and who weighed 80 pounds less than Mike and who had been dead since Mike was 7 years old. Mike did not answer immediately. The silence extended. Seconds. 10 seconds. 20. In a conversation, 20 seconds of silence was an eternity. In this room, in this darkness, after what had just been shown on this bedsheet, 20 seconds of silence was Mike Tyson processing something that his existing framework couldn't easily accommodate. Then Mike spoke. He didn't turn his head, didn't look at Kevin, kept his eyes on the bedsheet where the image had been, the white fabric now barely visible in the darkness, a ghost screen that had held a ghost fighter. I would never fight that man. The words arrived in the dark room with a weight that was disproportionate to their simplicity. 7 words, 7 common, ordinary English words, but arranged in that sequence, spoken by that voice, from that man. They carried a meaning that neither Kevin Rooney nor anyone else who would eventually hear them repeated had ever expected to hear from Mike Tyson's mouth. Mike Tyson did not decline fights. Mike Tyson did not express reluctance to face any human being on the planet. Mike Tyson's entire identity, the identity Cus had built and the identity Mike had internalized, was predicated on the absolute willingness to fight anyone, anywhere, at any time, without hesitation and without fear. The willingness to fight was the foundation of everything. Without it, the skills were meaningless. Without it, the training was wasted. Without it, the championship was a costume rather than a condition. And Mike Tyson, looking at a blank bedsheet in a dark room, had just said, "I would never fight that man about a person who weighed 135 pounds. Kevin waited. He knew Mike wasn't finished. The statement was too compressed, too simple to contain everything Mike was thinking. There was more behind it, the way there was more behind the surface of deep water, and Kevin waited for it to surface. "He moves like nothing I've ever seen," Mike said. The quiet voice, the private voice. "And I've seen everyone. I've studied every fighter on film. Ali, Lewis, Dempsey, Robinson, Marciano. I've seen them all. I've seen the best that boxing has produced in 100 years of boxing. He's not like any of them." Pause. The house creaked around them. "He's not a fighter. He's something else. Something I don't have a word for." Pause. Longer this time. Mike's breathing was audible in the silence, deep and slow. The breathing of a man who was working through something internally that required the same kind of focused effort that his physical training required. And he's showing restraint on that tape. He could have done more. Every time his opponent went down, he backed off. He chose to stop. That's the scariest thing, Kevin. Not the speed, not the kicks. The fact that he was in total control the entire time. He chose every outcome, every single one. Mike shifted in his chair. The leather of his jacket creaked. "I don't choose. When I fight, I destroy. It's instinct. It's what Cus trained into me. When a man goes down in front of me, I don't step back. I can't step back. The instinct takes over and I finish. That's what makes me the champion. That's what makes me dangerous." Pause. But this man destroys, and he chooses. He has the ability to finish and the ability to stop. Both. At the same time. Under pressure. In a real fight. That's a higher level, Kevin. That's something I've never seen in any fighter. Including me. The last two words sat in the darkness like stones dropped into still water. Including me. The undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, at the absolute peak of his powers, with a record of 34-0 and 31 knockouts, acknowledging that something existed that exceeded his own capabilities. Not in power, not in size, not in any of the metrics by which heavyweight boxing measured its practitioners. In something else. Something that Mike could see on the film, but couldn't replicate in the ring. A quality of control, of conscious decision-making under the pressure of real combat, that represented a dimension of fighting Mike's training hadn't addressed, and that his temperament might not allow. Kevin listened, didn't interrupt. This was the most reflective, the most honest, the most searching thing he'd ever heard Mike say about any fighter. About anything. Mike turned in his chair, facing Kevin for the first time since the film had started. "Cus saw this in '84. Yes. What did he say about it?" Kevin paused, choosing his words. "He said he'd never seen a human being move like that." And that was Cus talking. The man who trained Patterson and Torres and watched every fighter of the 20th century on film. The man who studied fencing manuals and samurai philosophy and who thought he'd seen every way a human body could move in combat. Cus said this man moved in ways he didn't know were possible. Mike nodded, slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he'd already concluded independently. "Cus was right to save this for me," Mike said. "I needed to see this." Why? The question was genuine. Kevin wanted to hear Mike articulate it, wanted to know if the lesson Cus had intended was the lesson Mike had received. Mike looked at Kevin with the directness that was his most disarming quality, the unblinking gaze that most people experienced as intimidation, but that was, in reality, simply honesty. Mike Tyson, for all his contradictions and complexities, was fundamentally honest in moments of genuine emotion. The dishonesty came later, from the people around him, from the image they constructed, from the gap between who Mike was and who the world wanted him to be. But in this room, in this darkness, with the ghost of Cus between them and the ghost of the shirtless man on the bedsheet behind them, Mike was as honest as he'd ever been. "Because I was starting to think nobody could teach me anything," Mike said, "that I knew everything about fighting, that there was nothing left to learn, that I'd seen it all and done it all, and that the rest of my career was just a matter of showing up and destroying whoever they put in front of me." He paused. His eyes, adapted to the darkness, were visible to Kevin as points of reflected light, the faint luminescence from the hallway, catching the moisture on their surface. "This tape shows me a man who makes me look limited. Not weak, Limited. He has weapons I don't have. He has control I don't have. He has a dimension of fighting that I didn't know existed. A whole dimension, Kevin. Not a technique, not a trick, a dimension. A way of moving and thinking and fighting that my training never touched. Another pause. The longest one yet. Mike was arriving at the core of what the film had given him. The lesson beneath the spectacle. The truth that Cus had seen in 1984 and that Cus had known Mike would need in 1988. And if I didn't know it existed, Mike said, what else don't I know? The question was not rhetorical. It was genuine, searching, the question of a man whose certainty had been cracked, not shattered, cracked by 9 minutes of 8mm film projected onto a bedsheet. The crack was small. A hairline fracture in the edifice of invincibility that 34 consecutive victories and the adulation of the world had constructed around Mike Tyson's self-concept. But the crack was real, and through it, something was entering that had been absent from Mike's psychological architecture for months, maybe years. Doubt. Not the crippling doubt that paralyzed. Not the corrosive doubt that destroyed confidence. The productive doubt that Cus had cultivated throughout Mike's training. The doubt that said I might not know everything, and that kept a fighter hungry, kept him studying, kept him training with the desperate intensity of a man who knew that the moment he stopped learning was the moment he started dying. Mike had lost that doubt. The wins had killed it. The knockouts had killed it. The championship had killed it. The sycophants and the entourage and the media who called him invincible had killed it. The doubt was dead, and with it, the humility that Cus had spent 6 years installing. The film had resurrected it. Not completely, not permanently. The doubt that the film restored would compete with the certainty that 34 victories reinforced, and the certainty would win more often than not, and Mike's trajectory toward the crisis that Cus had predicted would continue despite the film's intervention. The loss to Buster Douglas was 2 years away. The imprisonment was 4 years away. The ear biting was 9 years away. The long, painful, public unraveling of everything Cus had built was in motion and would not be stopped by one evening in a dark room with a bedsheet and a projector. But the film planted something, a seed of awareness that would survive the unraveling, a memory that Mike would carry through the victories and the defeats and the prison and the comebacks and the retirements and the reinventions, the memory of a night when he sat in the dark and watched a man who weighed 80 pounds less than him move in ways that made the heavyweight champion of the world say, I would never fight that man. That memory would surface in interviews for the rest of Mike's life. It would inform his public statements about Bruce Lee, the statements that interviewers would find surprising and that audiences would find moving. The heavyweight champion expressing genuine, unreserved respect for a martial artist who died before Mike threw his first professional punch. Mike stood from his chair. The movement was slow, the heaviness of the evening's emotional weight visible in the deliberateness of his rising. He walked to the projector, stood over it, looked down at the reel, the small spool of celluloid that had just changed something inside him. He reached down and touched the reel. His fingers, thick, scarred, the knuckles calcified from thousands of impacts, rested on the small plastic spool with a gentleness that contradicted everything those fingers were designed to do. Who was he? Mike asked, not looking at Kevin, looking at the reel. Not his name. I know his name. Who was he? Kevin considered the question. It was a bigger question than it appeared. He was a man who spent his whole life studying fighting, Kevin said. Not for money, not for titles, for understanding. He wanted to know what a human body could do, what fighting really was underneath the styles and the rules and the traditions. He stripped everything away until there was nothing left but the truth. And the truth is what you just watched. Mike nodded. His fingers stayed on the reel for a moment longer. Then he withdrew his hand and stepped back. Cus would have loved him, Mike said. Yes, Kevin said. He would have. They would have talked for hours. Cus and this man. They would have understood each other. I think so. Mike turned away from the projector, walked toward the hallway, stopped in the doorway, his silhouette filling it. The mass of him blocking the hallway light and casting a shadow back into the room where the bedsheet still hung on the wall and the projector still sat on the table and the electricity bill with Cus' handwriting still lay beside it. Thank you, Kevin, Mike said, for waiting, for knowing when I was ready. Thank Cus. He's the one who knew. Mike stood in the doorway for a long moment. The house around him, Cus' house, the house where he'd been made, held him the way it always held him, with the silent, structural embrace of a place that had been the first real home he'd ever known. Then he walked down the hallway, past the gym door, past the kitchen, to the front door, and out into the Catskill night. Mike Tyson left the house in Catskill at midnight. He drove back to New York City in silence, the radio off, the windows up, the highway empty at that hour, the headlights of the Mercedes cutting through the darkness of the Hudson Valley with the indifferent precision of a machine performing its function. The car knew the road. The road knew the car. The 2-hour drive required almost nothing from Mike's conscious mind, which was occupied elsewhere, replaying footage that no longer existed on a bedsheet, but that now existed permanently and indelibly in the neural architecture of a man whose memory for fighting was photographic in its precision. In the passenger seat, where no one sat, Mike could feel the presence of two men who weren't there. One was Cus D'Amato, who had been dead for 2 years and 4 months, but whose handwriting on an electricity bill had just changed how Mike understood his own capabilities. Cus was always present, in some form, in Mike's consciousness. The old man's voice lived in Mike's head the way a parent's voice lived in a child's head, a permanent commentary track that evaluated Mike's decisions and corrected his errors and reminded him of principles he was in danger of forgetting. But tonight, Cus' presence was sharper than usual, more specific. The note on the electricity bill had made Cus' absence feel less like absence and more like a different kind of presence. The presence of a man who'd planned beyond his own death, who'd left instructions for the living with the calm foresight of a general who knew he wouldn't survive the battle, but who wanted the battle won regardless. The other presence was the man on the film, the shirtless man, Bruce Lee, a man Mike had never met, would never meet, could never meet, because the man had been dead since Mike was 7 years old, since before Mike had thrown his first punch, since before Cus had found him, since before any of the events that constituted Mike Tyson's life had occurred. Bruce Lee existed for Mike only as an image on celluloid, a ghost made of light and shadow, 18 frames per second of movement that the camera could barely capture and that Mike's eyes, the best eyes in boxing, could not fully track. And yet the ghost was more vivid in Mike's mind at this moment than most living people. The straight lead that was invisible between frames. The combination that compressed 3 techniques into 1 second. The sweep that put the opponent on the floor. The step back. The step back. The step back that said I could destroy you, but I choose not to. The step back that demonstrated a quality of mastery that Mike's training had pointed toward, but that Mike's temperament had never allowed him to reach. The highway unrolled in front of him. Mile markers passed. The headlights found and released each one. Momentary illuminations in the ongoing darkness. Landmarks that existed only in the instant of their visibility before the car moved past and left them to the dark. Mike thought about what he'd said to Kevin. The words replayed in his mind with the same clarity as the footage. I would never fight that man. He examined the statement for inaccuracy and found none. It was true, not hypothetically true, not aspirationally true, literally, functionally true. If Bruce Lee were alive, if by some impossible circumstance the two of them were placed in a room and told to fight, Mike Tyson would decline. Not from fear. Mike Tyson did not experience fear in the way that most people experienced it. Cus had spent 6 years rewiring Mike's relationship to fear, transforming it from a paralyzing force into a propulsive one. And the result was a man who walked toward danger with the same ease that most people walk toward breakfast. The declination would come from something else. Something that didn't have a name in Mike's vocabulary, but that occupied the space between respect and recognition. The space where you saw another person's capability and understood that engaging it would not be a contest, but a collision between two complete systems, each operating at its maximum, each possessing tools the other couldn't counter. And the outcome would not be determined by skill or power or speed, but by which system happened to find the other system's gap first. And in that kind of fight, in a fight between complete systems rather than between fighters within a single system, the concept of winning lost its meaning. Mike had hit Bruce Lee once, and in the fight. One right hand, delivered with the 218 pounds of mass and the perfect hip rotation and the devastating timing that Cus had installed, would render a 135-pound man unconscious. That was physics. That was math. That was not in question. But could Mike hit Bruce Lee once? Could he find a man whose straight lead was invisible between frames, whose footwork created angles that didn't exist in boxing's geometry, whose timing was anticipatory rather than reactive, whose entire fighting methodology was designed around the principle of interception, of hitting you before you hit him, of reading your intention before your body expressed it? Mike didn't know. And Mike Tyson not knowing whether he could hit someone was, in itself, the answer to Kevin's question. The Mercedes crossed the Tappan Zee Bridge. The Hudson River was invisible below, a vast darkness beneath the bridge's lights. The water carrying its ancient cargo of current and history and the reflected glow of the bridge's lamps toward the sea. Mike barely noticed the crossing. His mind was in a room in Hong Kong, 16 years ago, watching a man move. He arrived at his apartment in Manhattan at 2 in the morning. The apartment was empty, which was unusual. Robin was somewhere with someone doing something that Mike had stopped asking about because the answers were never satisfying and the questions always started fights. The entourage was dispersed for the night. The various hangers-on and handlers and friends of friends who populated Mike's daily life having retreated to their own accommodations to wait for the next day's opportunities. Mike walked through the empty apartment. Large rooms, expensive furniture, the accumulated possessions of a man who'd earned $40 million in 3 years and who'd spent it with the compulsive generosity of a person who'd grown up with nothing and who couldn't quite believe that the nothing wouldn't return. The apartment was full of things and empty of people, the particular loneliness of wealth, the isolation that money purchased along with the penthouse and the cars and the custom suits. He didn't go to bed, didn't turn on the television, didn't call anyone. He sat in the dark of his living room, in a chair that had cost more than Cus' entire house, and thought about a man who'd been dead for 15 years. The thinking wasn't linear. It didn't follow the structured, analytical pattern that Cus had taught him for studying opponents. It was more diffuse, more associative, the kind of thinking that happened when the conscious mind released its grip on a problem and allowed the subconscious to work. Mike thought about Cus' note. Show to Mike when he's ready. Not yet. The not yet interested him. Cus had watched the film in 1984, when Mike was 18, when Mike was 12 fights away from the championship, when Mike was still forming, still absorbing, still becoming. Cus had decided that 18-year-old Mike wasn't ready. What had Cus seen in 18-year-old Mike that made him unready? What had Kevin seen in 21-year-old Mike that made him ready? Mike thought he knew the answer to the second question. Kevin had shown him the film because Mike was losing his humility, because the wins and the knockouts and the championship had built a wall of certainty around Mike's self-concept that was becoming impenetrable, because Mike was beginning to believe not just that he was the best, which was true within boxing, but that he knew everything about fighting, which was not true of anyone, and which the film had demonstrated with 9 minutes of evidence that Mike couldn't argue with. Kevin had shown him the film as a corrective, the way Cus would have shown him the film, if Cus had lived long enough to see Mike reach the point where the corrective was needed. The timing was Cus, even though the execution was Kevin's. The dead man had planned the lesson. The living man had delivered it, and Mike had received it, had sat in the dark and watched and said, I would never fight that man, and meant it with the full weight of his honest assessment, the assessment of a man who knew fighting the way a surgeon knew anatomy, deeply, specifically, professionally, and who had just seen something that exceeded his professional comprehension. Mike sat in the dark and let the lesson settle into him. Let it find its place in the architecture that Cus had built and that the world was slowly dismantling. The lesson wouldn't save the architecture. The lesson wasn't strong enough to counteract the forces that were pulling Mike apart, the toxic marriage and the predatory promoter and the entourage that fed on his wealth and the media that fed on his destruction. Those forces were too strong and too numerous for one evening in a dark room to neutralize. But the lesson would survive the destruction, would survive the architecture's collapse, would be there, intact, in the rubble, when Mike eventually began the long, painful process of rebuilding. A seed planted in the foundation, surviving the earthquake, waiting for the reconstruction. Well, don't I know? The question would become Mike's companion. Not immediately, not consistently, but persistently, surfacing in quiet moments, in the gaps between the noise of a life that was about to become very noisy indeed. The question would be there after the loss to Buster Douglas, when the invincibility myth shattered and Mike sat in a locker room in Tokyo trying to understand how a man he'd been expected to destroy had destroyed him instead. The question would be there during the 3 years in prison, when time moved slowly enough for reflection to occur, and the reflection was brutal in its honesty. The question would be there during the comebacks and the relapses and the slow, public unraveling that would consume Mike's 30s and 40s, the long aftermath of a peak that had been reached too young and descended too fast. Well, don't I know? It was the right question. The question that Cus had wanted the film to provoke. Not could Bruce Lee beat Mike Tyson? That was the world's question, the question that interviewers would ask and that fans would debate and that the internet, when it arrived, would argue about endlessly in forums and comment sections and video essays. That question was unanswerable and therefore unimportant. The important question was the one Mike had asked himself in the dark. Well, don't I know? The question that cracked the certainty. The question that restored the humility. The question that reminded the most feared fighter in the world that the world was bigger than his fear could fill. The next morning, Mike went to the gym. The gym in Manhattan was not the gym in Catskill. It was larger, better equipped, more populated. It had everything a heavyweight champion could want and nothing that a 19-year-old boy had needed. The Catskill gym had been a temple. The Manhattan gym was a facility. Kevin was there, having driven down from Catskill early that morning. He watched Mike warm up, skip rope, shadow box, the routine that preceded every training session, the physical preparation that Mike's body performed on autopilot while his mind engaged with whatever occupied it. Kevin noticed the change immediately. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have seen it. The sparring partners wouldn't see it. The entourage, if any of them had been watching, which they weren't, wouldn't have seen it. It required the trained eye of a man who'd watched Mike Tyson train for 3 years, who knew every nuance of Mike's training behavior, who could read Mike's physical output the way a conductor read an orchestra's performance. Mike was working on the double-end bag. The double-end bag was a small leather ball, maybe the size of a grapefruit, suspended between the floor and the ceiling by 2 elastic cords. When struck, it bounced rapidly and unpredictably, returning to the striker's range from different angles at different speeds. It was a timing tool, a precision instrument that required accuracy and reflexes rather than power. You couldn't muscle the double-end bag. You could only time it. Mike rarely worked the double-end bag. His training, by 1988, was dominated by the heavy bag and sparring, the power-oriented tools that reinforced his devastating knockout ability. The double-end bag was a finesse tool, and Mike's game was not built on finesse. It was built on controlled destruction, the application of overwhelming force with precise timing. The double-end bag didn't serve that purpose. But today, Mike was on the double-end bag, and he wasn't hitting it. He was tracking it, watching it bounce, following its movement with his eyes, his hands in guard position, but not striking, just tracking, learning to see, learning to follow unpredictable movement with his eyes. Kevin watched and understood. Mike was trying to see faster. Trying to improve, the perceptual speed that the film had shown him was insufficient. The straight lead had been invisible to his eyes, and Mike's response to that revelation was not despair or denial, but training. The fighter's response. The only response Cus would have accepted. You found a limitation? Train through it. You discovered a weakness? Strengthen it. You saw something you couldn't do? Learn to do it. After the double-end bag, Mike moved to sparring. But the sparring was different too. He'd asked his sparring partners to throw at half speed, and instead of countering, Mike was tracking, watching the punches come, following them with his eyes from initiation to arrival, not defending, not countering, watching, studying the telegraph, the preparation, the micro-movements that preceded the punch, retraining his eyes to see what he'd been unable to see on the film. After sparring, something even more unusual. Mike was working on something Kevin had never seen in practice, pulling punches short, throwing combinations at the heavy bag, but stopping each punch an inch from the bag surface. Not hitting it, stopping. The controlled deceleration of a fist traveling at full speed, arrested at the last instant by conscious decision. Restraint. The quality he'd seen on the film. The ability to throw and not land. The ability to destroy and choose not to. Mike was trying to train the quality that the shirtless man had demonstrated, the quality that Mike had identified as a higher level, and that he now wanted to explore in his own training. The pulling short exercise was crude, rough. Mike's massive fist stopped in front of the bag with visible effort, the muscles of his forearms and shoulders straining against the momentum they generated. It was not the seamless, effortless restraint of the man on the film. It was the first, awkward attempt of a man learning a new skill, the equivalent of a toddler's first steps, graceless but genuine. Kevin watched and felt, for the first time since Cus' death, something that resembled hope. "What are you working on?" Kevin asked, keeping his voice casual, as if the question were routine. "Something I saw last night," Mike said. Kevin nodded. Let the silence hold the space that questions would have cluttered. Then Mike said something that Kevin would remember for the rest of his life. "Kevin, I want to see other stuff. Not just boxing film, fighting film, karate, judo, whatever. I want to see how other people fight." Kevin looked at him. In 3 years of training Mike Tyson, in 6 years of knowing Mike Tyson, Mike had never expressed interest in fighting outside boxing. Boxing was his world. Boxing was his language. Boxing was the system that Cus had given him, and that had proven sufficient for every challenge he'd faced. The idea that Mike would voluntarily seek knowledge outside that system was as unexpected as the idea that a devout Catholic would voluntarily study Buddhism. "Why?" Kevin asked. Mike stopped hitting the bag. Turned to Kevin. The face was the champion's face, the public face, but behind it, visible only to someone who knew where to look, was the other face, the boy's face, the face that had watched a film in a dark room and asked, "What else don't I know?" Because last night, I found out there's a whole world of fighting I know nothing about. And Cus would have wanted me to learn. He was right. Cus would have wanted exactly that. Cus, who read fencing manuals and samurai philosophy, who studied every fighting discipline he could access, who believed that a boxer who only knew boxing was a limited boxer, would have celebrated Mike's desire to look beyond the ropes of the ring and into the vast, diverse, endlessly complex world of human combat. Kevin would provide the films. Over the following weeks, he'd acquire footage of karate tournaments and judo championships and kickboxing matches and the early, underground precursors to what would eventually become mixed martial arts. Mike would watch them with the analytical attention that Cus had trained into him, studying the techniques and the principles, identifying the elements that were universal across disciplines and the elements that were unique to each one. He would never become a martial artist. His body was built for boxing, and his skills were boxing skills, and his career would continue along the boxing path that Cus had laid. But his understanding would broaden. His appreciation for fighting as a complete human discipline, rather than a sport bounded by rules and traditions, would deepen. And his respect for the man on the film, the man who had embodied that complete understanding, would grow with each year. The respect surfaced publicly in interviews that spanned decades. In 1988, after the Spinks fight, a reporter asked Mike who he wouldn't want to face in a fight. The question was playful, the kind of hypothetical that interviewers use to fill airtime and generate quotes. Mike deflected at first, the champion's reflex, the refusal to concede vulnerability. "Anybody bigger than me?" "Nobody." Laughter. But later in the same interview, when the conversation shifted to martial arts, Mike's voice changed. The playfulness disappeared. Something sincere replaced it. "I have great respect for Bruce Lee. Great respect. He was something special. Not just a movie star. A real fighter. A real, genuine, scary fighter." The reporter, sensing something deeper than a generic compliment, pressed. "Scarier than any boxer?" Mike paused. The pause was longer than the question warranted. The silence of a man deciding how much truth to share with an audience that might not understand it. "Different kind of scary," Mike said. "Boxers are scary because they hit hard. Bruce Lee was scary because you couldn't see what he was going to do next. Different kind of fear." The reporter moved on to other topics. The quote was published, noted, filed, forgotten by most people. But the people who knew about the film, the small circle of trainers and martial artists and boxing insiders who'd heard the story of the Catskill viewing, recognized the quote for what it was. The public tip of a private iceberg. Mike Tyson telling the world, in the coded language of a man who couldn't share the whole truth, what he'd seen on a bedsheet in a dark room. In 1995, after prison, Mike was different. 3 years of incarceration had stripped away layers of performance and defense that the boxing world had built around him, leaving something rawer and more honest underneath. The Mike who emerged from prison was not the Mike who'd entered it. The invincibility was gone, destroyed by Buster Douglas in Tokyo and by the justice system in Indianapolis. What remained was a man who'd been forced, by the most brutal form of education, to confront the question the film had asked. "What else don't I know?" In prison, the answer had been everything. Mike discovered that he knew nothing about himself, nothing about the world outside boxing, nothing about the forces that had been dismantling his life while he was busy winning fights. The humility that the film had seeded had grown in the prison's dark soil, nourished by solitude and regret, and the man who emerged was, in some ways, closer to the man Cus had wanted him to be than the champion had ever been. An interviewer in 1995 asked about the greatest fighter ever. Mike's response was expansive, reflective, the response of a man who'd had 3 years to think about fighting and life and the relationship between the two. People ask me about the greatest fighter ever. They expect me to say Ali or Lewis or Marciano. Those are the greatest boxers. The greatest fighter? Man, I don't know. I saw things. I've studied things that made me think the greatest fighter might not be a boxer at all. Who do you mean? Bruce Lee. I've seen footage of Bruce Lee that most people haven't seen. Not the movies. The real thing. And on that footage, Mike paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that what he was about to say would be quoted and debated, and that accuracy mattered more than drama. On that footage, he does things that I don't think any boxer, including me, could deal with. The interviewer pressed for details about the footage. Mike deflected. The footage wasn't his to describe. The footage belonged to the chain of people who'd preserved it, to Ted Wong and Richard Bastillo and Kevin Rooney and the ghost of Cus D'Amato, to the dead man who'd filmed it and the dead man who'd saved it and the living men who'd kept it from becoming public. But the mention of footage entered the public discourse. People noticed. People asked. The existence of secret Bruce Lee footage became a subject of discussion in martial arts forums and boxing communities, the kind of half-confirmed rumor that generated speculation and debate in equal measure. In 2005, Mike was 40. Post-career, post-prime, post-everything that had defined him for 20 years. He'd lost the men he would have destroyed in his prime. He'd been knocked out. He'd bitten Evander Holyfield's ear on national television. He declared bankruptcy. He'd become a cultural phenomenon for reasons that had nothing to do with boxing and everything to do with the spectacular nature of his self-destruction. But he was also, at 40, more honest than he'd been at 21. The layers were gone. The performance was over. The man who remained was stripped down, essential, the core that had survived the demolition of everything that had been built around it. I'll tell you something, Mike said in an interview that year. I was the baddest man on the planet. I believe that. I still believe that in boxing. But there was a night, I was maybe 21, my trainer showed me a film of Bruce Lee. Not a movie, a real training film. And I watched that man move, and I said to myself, I would never fight that man. Not because I was afraid, because I respected what he could do. There are levels to fighting, man. Levels. And some levels are beyond what boxing can show you. The interviewer asked what was on the film. Mike smiled. The smile was private, the same kind of private smile that Bruce Lee had worn in the last frame of the footage. The smile of a man who possessed knowledge he wasn't going to share completely. I can't tell you everything that was on it. It wasn't mine to share then, and it isn't mine to share now. But I'll tell you what I saw. I saw a man who weighed maybe 135 pounds move faster than my eyes could follow. And my eyes were the best in boxing. I could see every punch from every heavyweight in the world. I couldn't see his. That's all you need to know. In 2015, Mike was 49. The wildness was gone, replaced by something that looked, from certain angles, like wisdom. The man who'd been the most feared fighter of his generation had become, through a combination of age and experience and the particular mellowing that comes from surviving your own worst impulses, a thoughtful commentator on fighting and life and the relationship between the two. Bruce Lee understood something that took me 30 years to understand, Mike said in an interview that year. His voice was softer than it had been at 21, the lisp more pronounced, the aggression absent. Control. He had total control, not just of his body, of the situation, of the outcome. He chose what happened. In my prime, I was a hurricane. I destroyed everything. But a hurricane doesn't choose. It just destroys. Bruce Lee was more like a surgeon. Every cut deliberate. Every decision conscious. The interviewer, sensing the depth of the comparison, asked where it came from. "'Cause tried to teach me that," Mike said. Control. Discipline. The hero and the coward feel the same fear. The hero acts in spite of it. But the master doesn't feel it at all, because he's in control of the situation, not reacting to it. That was Cus. And that was Bruce Lee on that tape. The same principle. Different man. Same truth. You wish you'd met him? I wish I'd met him. I wish I could have trained with him. Not to fight him. To learn from him. Not the kicks and the techniques. I don't need kicks. I'm a boxer. But the control. The ability to be in a fight and choose every moment of it. To be in the storm and be calm. That's what I wanted to learn. That's what Cuz was trying to teach me my whole life. And I didn't fully understand it until I was too old to use it. Mike paused. The interviewer waited. But I understood it, Mike said. Eventually. And that matters. That matters more than the title, more than the money, more than the record. Understanding it, even late, even after it could have made a difference in my career. Understanding it is what Cuz wanted from me. And a tape of a man who'd been dead for 15 years is what finally made me understand it. The tape itself completed its own journey. After the viewing in Catskill, Kevin Rooney returned the reel to Ted Wong, as promised. The loan was fulfilled. The conditions were honored. The reel traveled back across the country, from Catskill to Pasadena, from Kevin's hands to Ted's hands, from the drawer in the Victorian house to the drawer in the Pasadena home, where it had lived since 1975. Ted continued his private ritual. Each year, on July 20th, the anniversary of Bruce's death, Ted would set up the projector in his living room, load the reel, turn off the lights, and watch. 9 minutes of footage. 2 men in a room above a tea shop. The sparring, the combinations, the sweeps, the step-backs, the embrace, the close-up. Bruce's face in the final frame, looking into the lens, looking at Ted across the years. Ted would watch and remember. Remember the lessons. Remember the man. Remember the quality of Bruce's attention when he taught, the total focus he brought to every interaction, the sense that when Bruce Lee was talking to you, you were the only person in the world who existed. The ritual continued for 22 years. Ted Wong died on November 24, 2010, at the age of 73. He'd spent 37 years preserving Bruce Lee's legacy with a devotion that was more religious than professional, the devotion of a disciple who'd found his teacher and who never, for a single day, forgot the dead. After Ted's death, the reel passed into the archive of the Jeet Kune Do community, the informal collection of training materials and personal effects that Bruce's students had accumulated over the decades. Its specific location became unclear. Some said it was in the possession of Ted's family. Others said it had been donated to a private martial arts archive in California. Others said it had been lost in the transition, misplaced during the sorting of Ted's belongings, a small box in a large collection of small boxes, its significance invisible to anyone who didn't know what the label WS sparring, full contact, March 7 meant. The reel was formally lost, but the content of the reel was not lost, because everyone who'd seen it had described it to someone else. Ted had described it to Richard Bustillo. Richard had described it to his students. Kevin had described it to boxers. Cuz had described it in his notes. And Mike had described it in interviews that were broadcast to millions. Each description was a copy of a copy. Each copy was slightly different from the original. Details were added. Details were lost. The mythology growing even as the artifact itself disappeared. The straight lead became the fastest punch ever thrown. The combination became a sequence that no one could follow. The step-backs became proof that Bruce Lee had total mastery over life and death. The fill became the most important piece of fighting footage ever recorded. Some of these descriptions were accurate. Some were embellished. Some were pure invention, the creative contributions of people who'd never seen the film and who were working from third-hand and fourth-hand accounts. The mythology outgrew its source, as mythology always did, the story becoming larger and more vivid and more significant than the event it described. But beneath the mythology, beneath the embellishment and the invention and the layers of retelling that distorted the original, the core remained. The irreducible truth that survived every retelling, every distortion, every transformation from fact to legend. A small man, a private gym, a camera on a tripod, 9 minutes of full contact sparring that revealed, to everyone who saw it, that the human body was capable of things they hadn't imagined. And a heavyweight champion, watching in the dark, saying 5 words that no one expected. 2 rooms, 16 years apart, 8,000 miles apart, connected by a small reel of Super 8 film that weighed a few ounces and contained 9 minutes of footage and carried, in its celluloid frames, a truth about fighting and control and mastery that changed everyone who encountered it. In the first room, Hong Kong, March 1972, a man named Bruce Lee finished a sparring session with a friend. He was sweating, breathing hard, alive with the particular vitality of a person operating at the peak of his physical and intellectual powers. He walked to the camera, reached for the stop button. His face filled the frame, close-up intimate, eyes looking into the lens. The faint smile, the hand finding the button, the image shaking, the film stopping. He removed the reel, labeled it with a felt-tipped pen, put in a box. One reel among 37. A training record, a laboratory notebook entry. He didn't think about it again. He had a movie to finish, a family to go home to, a life to live that had 16 months remaining, though he didn't know it, and no one who loved him could have imagined it. He turned off the light in the gym, descended the stairs, walked into the noise and heat of Kowloon, went home. In the second room, Catskill, New York, March 1988, a man named Mike Tyson stood in a doorway, looking back at a bedsheet on a wall and a projector on a table and an electricity bill with a dead man's handwriting. He was 21 years old. He was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. He was the most feared fighter of his generation. And he had just seen something that made him say, "I would never fight that man," about a person who weighed 80 pounds less than him and who'd been dead since Mike was in second grade. Mike looked at the room for a long moment. The room where Cus had watched the same footage for years earlier. The room where Cus had written, "Show to Mike when he's ready." The room where two ghosts, the ghost of the teacher and the ghost of the fighter, had conspired across death and distance to deliver a lesson to a young man who didn't know he needed it. Mike turned off the light, walked down the hallway, walked out the front door, got in his car, drove into the night. 2 rooms, 2 men, 2 moments of turning off the light and walking away. 16 years and 8,000 miles between them. Connected by 9 minutes of celluloid. Connected by a lesson about control that one man embodied and the other man spent a lifetime trying to learn. Connected by the simple, devastating truth that the greatest fighters are not the ones who destroy everything, but the ones who could destroy everything and choose not to. The film is gone now, lost in the archives or lost to time, or sitting in a box on someone's shelf, its label fading, its content unknown to whoever possesses it. The projector that played in Catskill was returned to the neighbor, who used it to show vacation slides until the bulb burned out in 1991 and he never replaced it. The bedsheet was washed and returned to the linen closet. The electricity bill with Cus notes was kept by Kevin Rooney, folded into his wallet, carried for years until the pencil marks faded and the paper wore thin at the creases, and Kevin transferred it to an envelope in his desk drawer, where it remains. The film is gone, but the story of the film persists. In martial arts schools and boxing gyms and the conversations of people who care about fighting, the story circulates, told and retold, the details shifting with each telling, the core unchanging. There's a tape of Bruce Lee fighting for real. There's a tape that Cus D'Amato watched and called the most remarkable thing he'd ever seen. There's a tape that Mike Tyson watched and that made him say 5 words that no one expected to hear from the baddest man alive. "I would never fight that man." Not from fear, from recognition, from the understanding that some things exist beyond the categories you've built for them. From the humility of a man who was great enough to recognize a different kind of greatness and honest enough to say so. Somewhere in the gap between frames, between the 18th and the 19th image per second, in the invisible space where a straight lead traveled from guard position to chin faster than the best eyes in boxing could track, Bruce Lee is still moving, still fighting, still demonstrating to anyone with eyes to see and the honesty to admit what they're seeing, that the highest level of fighting is not destruction. It's the choice not to destroy. It's the step back. It's the control. It's the man on the film, looking into the camera, looking across years and miles and death itself, with calm eyes and a faint smile, knowing exactly what he is and needing no one else to confirm it. The projector is off. The room is dark. The film is still. But between the frames, in the space that 18 images per second couldn't capture, the ghost is still moving. He'll always be moving,